Your male and female slaves shall come from the nations around you. Can you demonstrate that they're coming by force from the nations around them, the Israelites? Can you demonstrate that?
Yes, they're bought. So it says nothing
Right.
about them selling themselves. It says that for
They're bought.
Israelites, so
Right.
there's already a
So
difference there.
can you
And
demonstrate that the
also,
buying is
and
of an
also,
involuntary nature?
of course,
How?
because you can't buy people.
Neat.
Okay, Snake, don't you dare try to speak. You are a lowly debater and you shall behave as such. That being said, here you go. Welcome everybody to our debate with JiL versus Snake. And Snake, my lowly debater friend, what topic are you debating today?
The Bible advocates slavery.
Oh, this one again. All right.
Yep.
Well, I've seen this one before. Let's see how this one goes. All right. So, with that being said, I see a new face on our channel. Demolish, would you like to introduce yourself? I think this is your first time on Debate Cafe.
Oh my gosh, it is my first time on Debate Cafe. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me as a guest host, guest judge. I appreciate that. You know, everybody here knows me actually. Through my channel, Demolish Doctrine. So I'm not going to do much of an introduction, but thank you so much for the privilege.
All right. Well, glad to meet you. And JiL, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, thanks for having me on Cinematic Snake. Richard, this is my third debate on slavery, so I'm excited. Can't wait to get into what the Bible teaches about slavery. Thanks for having me again.
And Snake, who the fuck are you?
Ask my asylum doctors, they'll tell you.
All right. Well, this is definitely going to be quite the show. We have already seen the talents of JiL on this particular topic, but I'm very excited to see how Snake is going to respond. And I feel like Snake has been coming up with their rebuttals repeatedly as they've been watching this debate unfold. So they've been training. They're ready. And with that being said, I have nothing left to say. So let's do this.
All right, I will start since I am the affirmative. So, the Bible displays no problems at all with the practice of slavery and, in fact, encourages it. The Bible explicitly tells slaves to act like slaves and respect the slave owners, one, to curry their favor, but also to respect God. It also tells them to obey slave masters so that it makes Christianity look good. It says slaves obey with fear and trembling. The Bible also says we are all slaves of Christ. Slavery is a word that's used in the Bible for a reason. The words it's translated from in the Greek and Hebrew are synonymous with slavery in English. To say otherwise is a claim that the biblical languages just cannot be translated, which is absurd. The United Nations and human rights organizations define slavery as entrapment in forced labor and or forced marriage. This practice goes on today with an astounding 50 million people in modern slavery, which is still slavery. Even if it's not the typical image of African slaves in the antebellum South, all forms of slavery are moral abominations, including in the Bible, yet the Bible has no interest in declaring this practice as a bad thing at all. So I have to show that the Bible endorses this practice as well. But more definitions, debt bondage, the most frequent first excuse for apologists, is still considered a form of slavery. Debt bondage is characterized by the repayment of debt with undefined services for an undefined duration, sometimes undefined duration, but it's not simply debt. This allows indefinite servitude and any service to be required, and those services are not applied towards liquidation of the debt, which is abuse of the debt, which is why it's slavery. So if any apologist tells you biblical slavery is just a form of employment or debt, they are either lying or mistaken. My own family has documents of our ancestors captured at the Battle of Dunbar, Scotland, and shipped to Boston as indebted slaves. We got to America as slaves, at least some of us, forced to work for their buyer, simply for losing a battle, as the Bible tells Jews to do with their captives. So if you talk about debt bondage, you are talking about my family. We have a diary and documents of people living through this. They describe slavery. It's not the same as the transatlantic slave, but does But does that make it not slavery? Absolutely not. All slavery is bad. Forced marriage is also a major form of slavery, still practiced to this day. Again, the United Nations passed a prohibition on forced marriage and debt slavery in the Supplementary Convention of Abolition of Slavery. Forced marriage is a practice explicitly blessed by God in his own words in the Bible. We'll get to that. A subset of forced marriage, which is bride buying, is absolutely still slavery, and this too is explicitly allowed in the Bible by God himself. This was a ubiquitous practice in the ancient world where women were treated as property to be traded typically by their own fathers. So the apologists will usually try to equivocate hired workers, chattel slaves, and Hebrew slaves and claim that this is just how jobs worked back then, that all mentions of slaves in the Bible are simply poverty-stricken hired workers turned servants or workers who owe a debt. Thus, it is a harmless practice and not really slavery at all. Regardless of what label we use, slave or not, this is an abhorrent practice. But of course, the Bible practices are the same exact concept as the English definition of slavery and the legal definition I gave. To drive the point home, beating of slaves is explicitly allowed to the brink of death and actually to death as long as they hang on for more than 2 days before dying from the beating. This is because the master loses productivity while the slave recovers or dies, which is apparently punishment enough for the slave owner. So this is not normal employment. The Bible explicitly states that the slave is the property of their owner. This is chattel slavery. Now let's look at how God himself commands the taking of slaves and conquest. And his advice on slavery is not to outlaw it, as he did with eating of shellfish, mixed fabrics, and idolatry. The Bible says you are to buy slaves from foreign nations and from foreigners living among the Hebrews. Quote, you can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and make them slaves for life. This is the word of their God directly. This is not mere hired work. This is the clear distinction between foreign slaves, Jewish slaves, and hired workers. Jewish slaves are given a special status. The Bible says not to treat Israelite slaves ruthlessly, and male Jewish slaves are given the right to go free after 6 years, but not the foreign slaves and their children, or female Hebrews or their children who are enslaved for life. So this is very clear. Hebrew slaves can be freed for a price on what you'd pay a hired worker. So even there's a distinction between hired worker and Hebrew slave. Jewish male slaves are given the right to freedom every 6 years. However, if the master gives him a wife, she and the children remain the master's property. And if the male slave wants to keep living with them, the Jewish slave must serve the master for life. This is entrapment. This isn't the practice of Israelites falling into corruption against God's will. This is God's word, supposedly. Slaves were also taken in conquest, and captives taken in war are referred to as plunder and spoils. This is a clear description of chattel slavery. If you doubt that these captives are trafficked as slaves, let's enlighten you. God says to Moses concerning the marrying of captive women, when you go out to war against your enemies and you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you desire to take her to be your wife, she shall be your wife. So she is given no choice. Her family slaughtered. She is taken in captivity by an Israelite man on his choice alone, and she is made to marry him. No mention of her consent, nor would any rational woman consent to marry her parents' killers and her own captors. So this is sexual slavery, the purpose of female captives. It does say don't treat her or sell her. This means she isn't forced to do labor, but she's still forced into a marriage, which is a form of sex slavery by definition. Just because she's not performing forced labor doesn't mean she's not a slave. It would be counted as slavery. So no, these practices are the same as modern concepts of slavery, whether the word slave is used or not. Female captives are taken for forced marriage, and female slaves are treated with fewer rights than male ones. God tells the Israelites that they can sell their daughters as slaves, and the men who buy these slaves may force them to marry themselves or their sons. Again, God himself supports forced marriage and traffic of women. Now, what are the typical objections to this information? Slavery is just a word for normal employment back then. It means something different in a biblical context. But no, captives taken in war are referred to as plunder and spoils and are forced to marry their captors. This isn't anything close to modern concepts of prisoners of war. This is a modern concept of slavery. Slaves are referred to as property and money. Slaves are bought and sold. The children of slaves are enslaved from birth and inherited as property for life. Adults are inherited as property for life. This is a clear description of chattel slavery. Slaves were traded and even sold to foreigners, forced into marriages. Even though Jewish slaves were treated better, they could still be traded and could sell their own children, which is most certainly not consensual, and not the same as regular employment or even owing debt. Apologists may say slavery is just temporary. They get released in the Jubilee. No, this is only for Jewish slaves and only male slaves at that, male Jewish slaves. And even if they're entrapped, and even they can be entrapped by the master's ownership of his wife and children. The Bible is very clear about this distinction between Israelite and foreign slaves. Foreign slaves are slaves for life, as described as property. The Bible says no kidnapping. Doesn't that mean no slavery? No, because one must not confuse the legal distinction between kidnapping and enslavement. Kidnapping was the taking of free men, aka Israel's citizens, or another man's slave, and this was illegal. Buying, trading, and selling foreign slaves or taking them in conquest was completely legal and was not deemed kidnapping. Israelites were an exception because why wouldn't they be? This was the morality of ancient barbarians justifying their evil in the name of God or whatever. This was a common legal code. So when the Bible says no kidnapping in Exodus, it actually clarifies later in Deuteronomy that this only applies to Israelites, thus confirming the legal distinction between the crime of kidnapping free citizens and the legal practice of slavery. This isn't something I'm pulling out of thin air either. The Roman Empire, famous for its slavery, also had the same legal distinction. Kidnapping was illegal in the slave-owning society of Rome. Kidnapping or plagium was applied only to free Roman citizens and the taking of other men's slaves. So meanwhile, it was perfectly legal to go out and kidnap slaves from the surrounding nations and own slaves in the Roman Empire. It's perfectly understood.
3 minutes remaining.
Kidnapping were separate concepts in the ancient Mediterranean. Scholars point out that this reference to kidnapping is expressly limited to Israelites, thus allowing the taking of non-Israelite slaves. Even though we today understand all enslavement is kidnapping, ancient peoples thought that these were separate concepts. Athens and Greece had the same laws. America had the same laws. And this is the consensus interpretation of the Bible. So yes, you are not allowed to just randomly take anyone as your slave. That's kidnapping. However, there were certain people you could take as slaves. States took no stance against kidnapping foreigners, but only fellow countrymen. This was the norm. Let us also remember this was the norm in America. America banned kidnapping, yet shipped slaves in the millions. So there's clearly a legal distinction. America also gives plenty of legal protections to slaves. This is nothing different than slavery as we understand it. In ancient Israel, if a man sleeps with a female slave, he shall not be put to death because she is not a free citizen. The Bible is very clear about distinct classes of people with different freedoms. Some have protections against rape and kidnapping, others do not. This is nothing unique. Every scholarly source, including other verses and translations of the Bible, recognize the ban of kidnapping only applies to Israelites. And not 5 verses after the Exodus mentions kidnapping, God tells Moses he can beat his slaves severely and that they are his property explicitly. So either you must say the Bible contradicts itself on the subject of slavery, or you must agree that the verse against kidnapping only applies to Israelites. There's no way out for the apologist. Final common objection: God allows slavery because it was a practice in a particular time and place and would have been really inconvenient and disruptive to change society by banning it. Sort of how God made the Israelites take a multi-generational trip through the desert and invade the lands of the Levant. That wasn't disruptive at all, right? It wasn't disruptive when he banned eating shellfish.
1 minute remaining.
Or idolatry, other practices that the Israelites could not quit doing. He intervened all the time and got mad about these things all the time. He never got mad about the practice of slavery. Israelite continuously made idols and things like that. It made God furious, but he never got furious at slavery. God did dislike when Hebrews were enslaved, but not because slavery itself is wrong, but because the Israelites were his property. The rescue device that slavery was bad but excusable back then because God was working with a particular time period and culture is invalid. That's moral relativism and doesn't fit with a God who supposedly has objective morality and standards that shouldn't change from time or place. It's no wonder Confederates used the Bible to justify slavery in America despite its obvious logical problems. There are no excuses, and thus it is conclusively proven beyond any reasonable doubt that the Bible not only condones but encourages slavery. Thank you.
And time.
All right. Thank you. I believe it's Jill's turn.
Where the Bible, without a shadow of a doubt, outlaws the practice of what we would call slavery today. The passage is found in Exodus 21:16. And I would like to provide a bit of scholarship on this issue. I certainly think I have an interpretation of the Bible. Every time I think I do, I find out that I'm wrong. So I wanted to look into some scholarship and also what's going on in the text, rather than trying to interpret it as I would if I were reading a 21st century text. Okay, so if anyone kidnaps another, so it's not just kidnapping going on here. If we just keep reading in the very same verse, and sells him. So this is describing what we would call slave trafficking. Okay, the punishment for doing such is death. Okay, and it didn't matter if you were an Israelite or someone who was a foreigner. The Bible teaches that we are to treat everyone, whether they're living in our quarters or whether they're traveling abroad from other countries or other nations. You were to treat sojourners with you as the native among you. So that debunks any notion that there is a slavery for you and then a slavery for thee. Okay. Exodus 21, there should be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you, who travels among you. You shall not wrong a sojourner or a traveler or oppress him. Why? Because you were once sojourners in the land of Egypt, speaking to the time where the Israelites were a vassal state. To the suzerain, that would be Egypt. So there's a lot more going on here than just someone taking away your rights and making you a slave. Okay, remember, this is not a text that we're reading in the 21st century, but in ancient times. There's some more passages here you can read on your own time. I don't have time to read them all, obviously. Dr. Westbrook, one of my favorite scholars in this field, probably the leading scholar when it comes to linguistics. He says, in law, a slave may be defined as a person who is owned by another in the manner of a chattel, right, or property, subject only to special considerations that may arise from his humanity. The native terminology can be misleading, speaking of the native Israel. In the strongly hierarchical societies of the region, the term slave was used not only to refer to a person owned in law by another, but to any subordinate in the social ladder. Thus, the subjects of a king were called his slaves. He even called them, sometimes they were even called sons, even though they were free citizens. So when we look into the text, when we see the word slave, we don't need to automatically assume that that person is there against their will. They're free citizens, and still they can be called a slave. The king himself was a vassal. The slave was, or he was a slave of the emperor. And commoners alike were slaves of the gods, or everyone was a slave of the gods. Okay, a social inferior, when addressing a social superior, referred to himself out of politeness as "quote unquote" your slave. So there are. Westbrook goes on to say, in a legal context, that would normally be the legal meaning. All right, that's from Slave and His Master in ancient Near Eastern law. Dr. Paul Copan writes a book, It's God a Moral Monster. That's a really good one. I would recommend Is God a Moral Monster and Did God Really Command Genocide? Just to get some some scholarship on this issue. The Old Testament prohibited unavoidable lifelong servanthood unless someone loved their master and wanted to be attached to himself or to the master. So we can't look at a passage that says lifelong or slave for life and automatically assume that the slave is there against his will. That's an assumption that needs to be proven, not just simply assumed. That will be my challenge for my opponent tonight. Masters were to grant their servants release every 7 years. And remember, this applied to the non-Hebrew, the sojourner, as it did the Hebrew. A slave's legal status was unique in the A&E, a dramatic improvement over A&E law codes. And one of those improvements was an ethic that we adopted today in our country, which was built off the back of Protestant or Protestantism or the Bible. 97% of the pilgrims who came over here, quote unquote, were Protestants. Okay, so a biblical ethic that came over with them on the Mayflower was that no man had the right to own another without that man's consent. Okay, so simply owning someone in their world was not a bad thing. In fact, you wanted to be owned by someone, a wealthy landowner, because you could possibly inherit the land. So Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only servanthood. And keeping with the variableness of notions of property in the A&E, as noted by historians and anthropologists, Israel's notion of property was a severely restricted one, and one that did not preclude the humanity of the servant nor absolve the master from legal accountability. So the suzerain was responsible for the vassal. Okay, and that's on every social ladder or status, whether it be on a global or a government scale, or the king, and then there's a lesser king, or a landowner, a wealthy landowner, and a sheep herder, or a traveler, or a sojourner from other lands. Okay, in the Old Testament, outsiders did not impose servanthood as they did in the antebellum South. Masters could hire servants from year to year and were not to rule over them ruthlessly. Leviticus 25. These were servant, master, or what they call Suzerain-Vassal treaties. That's what you're reading. When you're reading Leviticus 25, you're not reading a law as we would in a civil sense. You're really reading an actual treaty, like Versailles. That's what you're reading. That's why JiL talks about the Geneva Convention. If you're going to point to cases of treaties, then I can look at the Geneva Treaty, can't I? Or Versailles, for instance. All right, so that's what's really going on here. Right, and these individuals would be embedded into the homes of the Israelites. Okay, they didn't live in the outhouse like in the antebellum South or in a ditch. Right, that's Dr. Paul Capan. In most cases, servanthood was more like a living employee, temporarily embedded within the employer's household. Even today, teams trade sports players to other teams that have owners, and these players belong to a franchise. So we still have a remnant of that type of ownership language. All right, but
3 minutes remaining.
Thank you. We know what we mean by ownership. We don't mean that there is any volition being, or anyone's volition being violated. Right? We know it's a formal contractual agreement that is to be fulfilled. Dr. Chase Schuyler, in English, we regularly use commercial language to describe people when the context is commercial. Trading teammates or trading players. We don't use this language, she says, because we think they're less than human. It's not to put them on the level of furniture. Okay, that's not the point when we use these terms today. So it would be very dishonest for a culture 200 years, 300 years to read our text and say, look, this is slavery. Okay, Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only servanthood. Okay, and it is to be noted that the conditions were such, so the conditions and stipulations were such, was that the first item of legislation catered for the person who loved his master and did not want his freedom. So he wanted to be there. That's the first legal item that you have to address. Did the event want to be there? All right, and then Suzerain-Vassal treaties, they're called. There was several parts to these treaties. The suzerain of the land, you would enter into relationship with the vassal. There were rules for this covenant. You were to love and serve. You were to be loyal to the suzerain, and even
1
in
minute
warfare.
remaining.
Okay, you were to swear in front of witnesses that you would not break this covenant or this treaty. And then there you see like an animal being slayed. The animal was actually cut in half, and both parties would walk hand in hand, and they would recite this statement here to each other. So this was, and they would actually touch the blood. It's sort of like a blood covenant, right? And they would recite this term: if I do not uphold this covenant, may what happened to this animal happen to me. All right, so what we see going on in the Old Testament is not what we saw in the ancient antebellum South, as we can clearly see. Thank you.
And 5 seconds remaining. Cinematic, next section.
Yeah, let's do it. All right, so 10 minutes of interrogation.
Okay. Jill, can you define slavery?
It's defined. I like there's several definitions I could use. So I could cite Geneva. Enslavement is owning or forcing someone to work against their will.
Okay. Does that definition fit with the instances I described, like in Leviticus 25?
No, because Leviticus 25 would be an instance of a suzerain or someone entering into relationship with the vassal, with someone who
is there
traveling
any
or something.
verse that substantiates that claim?
What claim?
That there is a consensual agreement or contract.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find some for you. What do you want the verse exactly to say?
Actually, we'll get to that. So do limitations to slavery mean that it isn't slavery? Like saying that you can't be harsh to the slaves, does that mean it's not slavery?
No, that wasn't my claim.
Okay.
My claim is that you cannot force
so next question
enslave.
is to your knowledge,
Can I answer that question? Can I answer the question you just asked?
No.
Yeah, the idea is
So,
what
to your knowledge, do the American legal codes also prohibit ruling over slaves ruthlessly?
the idea is that you can't force them to be a slave. That's a distinction I draw, not harshness.
That was not the question. To your knowledge, did American legal codes also prohibit ruling over slaves ruthlessly?
I don't use that as an argument, ruling over ruthlessly. You just propped up a straw man. I never use that argument that's a distinction that's made between slave and non-slave. So
to your knowledge,
you're setting up a straw man.
Is there any sports contract that says players shall be the possession of the team owner for life, and or can be beaten? Any combination of those? If
they want to be, yes. If no one's chose to be in that position, then there wouldn't be any example of that.
Shall be.
There wouldn't be any example if no one chose that type of position. That type of position is not a desirable position in our culture because we retire at 45. And that's a goal in our culture. That wasn't the case in their culture.
Can you read this passage that I have up?
That's called a presentism fallacy, by the way.
Can you read this passage and tell me?
Yeah, sure.
Where
Leviticus 25, the sojourner.
This is the King James translation.
Right. Who is the sojourner the sojourner is the traveler, ye shall buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule over another with rigor.
Now, does that say that sojourners are to be treated the same as Israelites, as you claimed?
Yes, sojourners are to be treated the same as Israelites. They would be
It
under
says that?
law. Yes, sojourners would be
Where
under
does it say
that law.
that?
The suzerain of the land is entering into relationship. This is a suzerain treaty with someone entering into their land.
Where does
So
it
the
mention a
idea
treaty?
was,
Where does it mention a treaty or a
well,
covenant
you're reading
of
two
any
verses.
kind?
You're reading two
Where
verses of a
they're
chapter.
right next to each other. They're right
Right, but
next to each other.
that's one
So
section of an
where in
entire
this section,
context.
where in this section that you just
And
read, or in the surrounding verses, does it say that sojourners are to be treated the same? Where in this
I
thing where
read
it says
several
of
passages.
sojourners they shall be your
Let me-
possession forever, but of the children of Israel, and then it gives a different rule. What about that says to you
Yeah,
that they should be
Leviticus
treated the same?
19. Leviticus 19. You can also go to Exodus 12. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. There was
Okay,
also
good
an
enough for
idea.
me.
There was yeah, okay.
So you can see that there are two different laws for the sojourners and for the Israelites.
No, the sojourner had
Isn't
every
that what you just said?
opportunity.
There
No,
shall be
Exodus 12. There shall be one law for the native, and for the stranger. So it's one law for both. One
What
law
did you
for
just
the
say about
native.
Leviticus 19?
Leviticus 19 says, "You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. You shall love him as yourself." So this you
And
should
yet,
treat them as yourself.
concerning slavery, it recommends different rules, does it not?
No, you are to treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you.
Does the Bible say that Israelite slaves shall be your possession forever?
If they want to be. That
And
is a
does
decision
the
that you would
Bible
make
say
on your
that
own.
about sojourner slaves?
Anyone who wants to work in the land of Israel,
Does the
you would,
Bible say they shall be
yes,
your slave
yes,
forever, or
anyone,
does
yes.
it not say that?
Anyone who wants to be a slave for
Not
life
what I
can be a
asked.
slave for life. If you were a sojourner, you could do that. If you were an Israelite, you could
Does
do
the
that.
Bible say anything about the option for the sojourner, or does it say they shall be your bondman or your slave or aved forever?
They shall be, yes.
Okay,
They shall be, yeah.
right.
Right. So yeah. So is that force?
Do
No.
do captives in war consent to be married to their captors? Is this a reasonable assumption?
Yes, many have. I can tell you some stories. I have
I don't
friends
care
who have.
about many. I care if it's
Yes. Yes, they
like
do. Yes.
all of them.
I couldn't say if all of them were.
Is
That's
consent
not.
required? Is consent
If they
required? Is the
did,
question.
if they did, that would be a violation of scripture. If they forced them, that would be a violation of scripture.
Is consent required?
Yes, consent
Where does
is
it say
required.
that?
Yes.
Where does it say that?
You are to
Cite a
treat the
verse. Can you
sojourner
cite for me a
as
verse where it
Leviticus
says
19.
consent is necessary for a captive to marry her captor?
Okay, you shall
2.5
not,
minutes remaining.
Exodus 23:9, you shall not oppress a sojourner, for
That's
you
not an
were
answer to the question. Can
sojourners.
you cite a verse
Yes,
that
it is an
says
answer to the question.
captives captured in war
Okay.
who are wanted by the captors to be his wife? Can you cite a verse that says she needs to consent before that?
I cite a verse that says she needs to consent?
Yes.
They didn't speak in those. Why would I?
Claimed that they were all.
Do you have a
that
verse
consent
that
was
says she's
necessary.
being forced instead of just propping up that idea that is the case? The
It
burden of
says
proof is on you to prove that she's being forced.
For context,
That's on
it
you.
says when you go out to war against your enemies and you see among the captives a beautiful woman and you desire to take her to be your wife, she shall be your wife. Is there any mention of consent in that?
The burden of proof is on you to
Is there any
determine.
mention of consent
Yes.
in that?
Yes, in Exodus 22, you shall not wrong a sojourner. It would be wrong to oppress a sojourner or anyone.
So if the legal code allows for the beating of or enslavement of a person, is that technically wrong under the code? If there's an allowance in the
If
law?
there's an allowance for beating, it would be an allowance for every human being who broke the law. So in the scriptures, you have what's called corporal punishment, and some countries still practice that today. So the same
Well,
laws
what
would
I'm
apply to someone who broke the law, who was not a slave.
what I'm
1 minute
asking
remaining.
is, are legal acts illegal?
Are legal acts illegal?
Correct. So
It would
if
be legal to beat someone if it were punishment for a crime in our country. It used to be. Now we just put them in jail.
it's
So you can't
legal
just take
to
the
enslave
action
someone,
apart from the context and just say the action is wrong.
if it's
Depends on
legal
who's
to
arrested you.
if it's legal to enslave someone, is that going to be an offense in the law if you enslave someone?
It's legal to enslave someone if they violate the law. If they violate the law, they lose those rights.
So that's not an
They
offense.
forfeit those rights, even in our country. Yes.
So that's not an offense. Okay.
No, because they forfeit those rights. They broke the law.
So it's not an offense.
Right. Governments can arrest you, put you in jail if you violate the law, and they have to prove it in the court of law.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what the 13th Amendment says, I think, or 14th. I'm not sure.
And if you're prepared to cross, Jill, when you begin.
Yeah. All right. So just a few things about your opening there. There was so many points. I don't know where to begin. But Colossians 3, do you know that there's a difference between Roman slavery and Israel? Can you tell us one difference between slavery in Israel, quote unquote slavery, and slavery in Rome?
I can tell you differences in the legal code as I cited both of them on screen.
Yeah, what's one difference?
So, for instance, the Roman legal code is more explicit about kidnapping your neighbor's slave, for instance. I don't believe the Bible mentions that. Anyone is liable if they conceal, sell, imprison, or acquire a Roman citizen, whether freeborn or freed, or another man's slave.
Okay, so you think they're synonymous? Bride
I
buying.
don't think they're synonymous. They are similar, though.
They're similar. Okay. Bride buying. So, but that's Colossians 3 is talking about Roman slavery. So when Paul is telling Philemon to go back to his master or to obey his master, we don't know the scenario in which he wound up in that situation. Okay, but we assume that Paul is not telling him to go back to someone who is trying to kill him or abuse him. So he could have been in a financial situation where he was paying back debt, a Suzerain type of deal, but in their culture, they probably called it something different. So we can't automatically assume that the person there in bondage is there because they're being forced to be there. Sometimes they make a bad financial decision, like also today. Okay. Now you brought up Leviticus 25. Yeah. What is Leviticus 25? What are you reading? What do you think you're reading when you're reading Leviticus 25?
With the whole chapter, the thing that I focused on was the fact that you can inherit slaves as property and make them slaves for life.
What I'm asking is, what is the document itself? What is it? Is it a novel? Is it a law book? What are you reading when you pick up Leviticus? What are you reading? When I pick up Shakespeare, I'm reading
document
poetry.
that begins as the Lord said to Moses at Mount Sinai. So it's the God of the Bible telling Moses how to enslave people and who to enslave.
So you didn't hear a word that I said about the Suzerain-Vassal Treaty. What you're reading is an actual treaty. So let me ask you this. Would it be fair if I were to pick up Versailles, and I were to start reading some of the provisions of Versailles 300, 400 years later, 5,000 years later, and I were to say that the United States enslaved Germany? Would that be honest, or would that be accurate? Yes or no?
You can make a case for it.
Okay, so the Germans were forced to pay the Allies 33 billion in reparations over a period of 30 years. That's not a lifetime, I guess, for many. Is that slavery?
You can certainly make a case for that, since they are forced to pay that money.
Okay, so the United States violated
forced
its
to
own,
work to pay money.
so the United States violated its own charters and commissions on slavery. Is that
It's certainly not unheard of.
okay? All right, or maybe it's not
Government
considered
hypocrisy is about the most common thing you'll find.
okay, or maybe it's called the spoils of war. To the winner goes the spoils
Sure.
of war. It's an age-old concept. Nothing
Yep.
has changed. The Israelites had warfare. They had to go to war, just war. You seem to imply that there was any unjust, or there was an unjust or a nefarious motive. Do you have any evidence that of any nefarious motive amongst the Israelites, that they were just doing this for some sort of land grab?
Oh yeah, the God of the Bible says this. Go to war because I've promised you this land. It is literally a land grab, and they take captives for their own personal benefit. They say, "Oh,
Okay,
that
thank
girl
you.
looks
So
hot
your
to
answer is
me,
you
so
think
I'm
it's a
going
land
to
grab.
force her to marry me."
Right. So do you have any evidence outside of your brain that this was just merely a land grab, and that's all the text says that was going on in these lands? Do you have any scholarship to support such?
Would you like the verse?
I want any sort of scholarship to support that that was the only reason why the Israelites went to war.
God told them that it was.
Okay. Um, can you list a second reason why God sent them to war, the Israelites? You said one was land
Because
grab.
they're
What was
his
the second
people.
reason? What were the reasons that were given in Scripture?
He said, because I've made a covenant with Abraham and thus Israel, that this land shall be yours. And so it's literally just a land grab.
Okay, so you've never read Leviticus 18, which comes before Leviticus 25, that you like to cite. So,
I've read the
the
whole
problem
Bible.
here is that you don't know what you're reading. You're reading a treaty. You're reading what's called the Suzerain-Vassal Treaty. So the reason why God keeps saying his name over and over again, I am the Lord God, I am the Lord God, follow me, is because people who are coming from other countries are reading this treaty out loud, and they're swearing, even if they're swearing on their false gods, they were to repent and then take on all of the blessings of Israel. So sure, when you come to the United States, you do have more benefits than someone who is here on a visa. That's not slavery. So pointing to different types of work for different types of folks is not an example of slavery. Okay. How much time do I have left?
You have 3 minutes, 20 seconds.
Okay. So you would consider, you're sort of iffy on the war guilt thing, I guess. So war guilt is okay. Is that illegal?
I don't know what that
What about
means.
military?
War guilt?
Right. You have to, if you lose a war in modern times, your country has to pay
3 minutes
reparations.
remaining.
Reparations. Okay. So
What's the question?
yeah. So what about military restrictions? When we win a war and we tell that other nation that you can only have so many planes, or you can only have so many airplanes, and those types of provisions or rules of that covenant, is that slavery?
It's not the ownership of humans as property as described in the Bible.
Okay, so that's not slavery. Yes, that's a yes or no.
Limiting someone's military capacity isn't the ownership of humans strictly, although you could certainly make a case for that. Certain anarchists certainly would, because it's the government does own you. I would agree with that.
Okay. All right. And you talked about bride buying. I noticed you looked like you pieced together some Wikipedia article. Did you find that bride buying article under the category of slavery? Are you suggesting that bride buying is slavery?
It's actually in the UN Convention Against Slavery.
Right. But that it seemed as though that was a so if a family buys or says that my daughter is going to marry this family and all parties are in agreement, is that slavery? And they're bride buying. They're bride buying each other. They're swapping brides, basically. The brides of, or the women of one family is marrying and everyone's having a ceremony, and they're being women from the other family are marrying the sons from the other family, etc.
1 minute remaining.
And they're exchanging monetary goods, luxury cars. Is that slavery?
It's slavery when it's at the buyer or the seller's discretion. If there's no necessary consent from the bride, then it's slavery.
Okay. So volition is what you need to demonstrate being violated. The burden of proof would be on you to demonstrate volition being violated. Otherwise, it's just simply looking and seeing bride buying is not evidence of slavery. Okay. The Deuteronomy 21, where did you read in Deuteronomy 21 that anyone was forced into marriage? Where did you read that someone was being forced into marriage?
Let me see here. That was the verse about how if a captive, a soldier in war sees a captive woman who he finds beautiful, he can take her to be his wife without any mention of consent from the woman.
Yeah. So you assume that there was no consent because there was
20 seconds over.
Should I answer or?
Well, it's open discussion until about 28 minutes from now, so you're free to answer.
Okay.
But it's just going to be open for the rest of the debate. So, yeah.
Okay. I'm happy to address that question. What was the question again?
Yeah. What's your evidence that people are being forced into marriage?
Right. Because there are captives taken in war and it gives no consent. So I don't actually have to show that there are individual instances of taking someone against their consent. I have to show that consent is not necessary.
Right. So because they're captives in war, that you automatically assume that they then they didn't have the decision later to marry one of the soldiers.
Doesn't say that they have the decision, so consent is not necessary. Therefore, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if she consents or not. It says if he wants her as the wife, she shall be the wife. No mention of her consent.
So do you consider men and women who fought in our country, if I can share my screen, who took captives, and some of those captives they actually took back to the States with them and married, or maybe they married them right there on the battlefield. Who knows? That's a romantic novel waiting to be written. Richard, what do you think? So what would you say that these young men? Would you say that these men here are practicing sex slavery?
Possibly. If there is no requirement of consent from the woman, then yes.
Okay, so you would have to demonstrate in each case that there is some being forced. So you don't assume here in this case that they're being forced. You don't assume
because if consent is not necessary, that means it doesn't matter if she consents or not. If she doesn't consent, he can still make her the wife. That means the institution itself, the rules itself allow for slavery. So I don't have to demonstrate anything about any specific person.
So you can just assume that that was part of the American culture, that
I don't
to
care
go
what
over
part
to
was
a
part of
land
culture.
and kill the enemy and marry their wives. You just assume that that's forced, that the woman doesn't want to have anything to do with that relationship.
Well, we can look at the laws and see if there is any necessary consent from her side of things, but we can also just do the smell test. Is a woman whose family is slaughtered in a war, is she going to consent? Does that pass the smell test to you, or is she just taken in conquest?
I think, yeah.
That's the context.
If I were to be in that
reasonable
situation,
conclusion.
well, sure. If I was a woman in that situation, I would marry my captor, and my children would be safe. So is that slavery?
If you weren't given a choice.
What choice did I did have a choice. I could die in the wilderness.
That is a coercion, which is not considered consent.
So this young man, if this guy here, after fighting the Viet Cong,
I wiped out your family, and I'm going to, you can marry me if you want.
Right. So if he were to find her in the bushes, huddled up, and he were to take her back to the transport vehicle, and then during her hospital stay in the hospital, the military hospital, they start a relationship, you would call that slavery?
Nope. I would call it slavery again if she had no choice, as is dictated in the Bible.
Okay. So, but you haven't demonstrated that there's no choice in the Bible. You just assumed that.
No, it says that if the man wants her to be his wife, she shall be his wife. So the Bible says it's only on the behest of the man. It mentions nothing about her consent. If he wants it, he shall get it. That means no consent for the woman.
That's an assumption you're making onto the text. You have to do more than just say. In the Bible, they use terms when it comes to he and she, or personal pronouns or pronouns. That the law would apply to anyone, male or female. So you can't just assume sexism. You have to prove it.
Yeah, I just did. And Praise made a really good point. She's also given a period of mourning for her slaughtered family. Not really. It doesn't sound like something that is a romantic entanglement. It sounds like a captive who is taken as booty in war.
Like that young lady and those kids that came later.
Could have been. I don't know about her story. If the United States laws say that the man can just choose any woman, any captive woman he wants, and thus it shall be, then that would be slavery. That would be a problem. That's what the Bible says.
You can actually take captives, and our laws do say that. Geneva does say you can take captives. You didn't know that, did you?
Of course it says you can take captives.
Okay.
But it doesn't say that you can marry a captive just because you want to, does it?
What? He wanted to marry. You have to be able to assume.
Did you listen to what I said?
That you have to assume that that's against the law. You can't assume that's against the law.
What? Why would I
assume
that's against the law?
that marrying someone is against the law?
Why would I
assume
that?
Assumption. Marrying someone is not against anyone's law. You just,
you're not
just
listening
assume
to what I said.
that the woman is being forced because the Bible speaks in the terms of the male pronoun.
Nope. What I said was
into the Bible.
If the Geneva Convention or the United States or the Japanese law says that any captive you find attractive shall be your wife, that would be slavery. That's what the Bible says. But that's not what the Geneva Convention says. That's not what American or Japanese law says. That's what the Bible says. So I want you to understand the difference between. If you could steel man my position here, what am I saying is the difference between captives who you marry consensually and captives who you just decide are your wife?
Okay, you're assuming that they just decided to be their wives without the consent. No, the Bible is giving this is a treaty. You don't even know what you're reading. It's a treaty between a vassal and a suzerain or a king. Okay, that's what you're reading. So you
it's a
can't
treaty
read
between
that.
governments, not the
So
individual woman.
okay,
She doesn't
right.
consent. So I'm
So
right,
she
you're wrong.
right. So that doesn't mean that people are being forced against their will.
It
You're
means
just
that their
reading that
consent,
into it. You're reading
it
that
means
into the text.
it means that their consent is legally not relevant.
Their consent is relevant. They were
It
to
doesn't say that anywhere.
there were rules of the covenant. You entered into relationship with the suzerain. You were actually, they were supposed to protect you from other invading nations. So you became sort of like one of the U.S. territories, what we would call a U.S. territory. If someone attacked you, you attack the suzerain king.
So there is
So
no consent. That
there
you're
is
talking about
consent.
a government
So
to a government. The woman
what?
herself is not giving any consent. You can't find a verse. You can't find
And you
anything that says that it's consent.
and you can't find any reason to condemn, because our laws do not condemn a suzerain of the land entering into relationship with a young girl and
But our
marrying her.
laws,
That is not against the
right,
law.
right. But our laws do condemn just demanding a captive woman be your wife,
Well,
which
you
is what
can't.
the Bible condones. The Bible
You haven't
says,
demonstrated
if
that.
you desire to take her, she shall be your wife. End of
Yes, and
story.
that man desired to take her, and she became his wife.
Maybe.
Okay,
Maybe
so
she
all the
consented. We
Bible is
don't
doing,
know.
all the Bible is saying, you have the consent to do that.
The Bible does not say
It
that. That
doesn't
is a
say.
lie. Stop
It
lying.
says you have the right to do this. The Bible is giving you
It
permission
says
to
the
take
man.
wives of
It says the
captives.
man has the right to take the wife.
Right,
Period.
but
End of
you're
story.
still
Done.
you're still assuming that the wife has no say in the matter. Just like
Because it
but
says
you
she
didn't
doesn't.
assume that when it came to the American soldier who married one of the captives.
Because
Don't
we
you
don't
see
have the
the
legal
hypocrisy?
code, or it's not
You don't.
hypocrisy. You are
I
still
I, I think
ignoring the
you see it.
difference.
I think you see there's a clear double standard here. You'd never
No,
assume
because
that
I'm not
the
lying like
soldier
you are.
you never assume that the soldier did anything nefarious or wrong, but you assume that in the case of the Jews.
Because he didn't cite a legal code that said I wanted her to be my wife and thus she was my wife. Show me that. That's the difference that you are
Okay,
ignoring actively. And
if
I
I'm going,
understand you're in a
okay,
really desperate position.
if I'm God and I'm telling you what you may do when you go into the land, you don't have to have the same type of law in America. If it's not against the law, you can do it in America. Okay, it's not against the law, so you don't need a law telling you what you can do. Laws are designed to tell you what you can't do. The reason why God is telling them what they can do when they go into the land is because these women would then become destitute, and if they didn't have a captor or a suzerain, they would probably die. So
The
God is
law
coming in.
says if you desire it, it shall happen. That is not the
If
American
he
law.
yes, if he wants to
No, that's
marry
not the
her,
American law.
he should marry her. Yes.
No, American law does not state if you want to marry a
I
captive
never said it
woman,
did.
she
It
shall
doesn't
marry
have
you.
to state it. It's against the law. Our laws are designed to tell you what you can't do. You're comparing our laws to Suzerain vassal laws.
Right,
Okay,
our laws are better.
vassal laws are different than the laws of America.
Right, because our
America doesn't.
laws
There isn't a
include
law, Snake.
consent.
There isn't a law that says I can't cut you off when you're speaking. There's no law, right?
Right.
Okay,
So
so
what does
the
that have
law
to do with
doesn't
the
tell you.
fact that the Israelite law says that if you want her as your wife, she shall be your wife?
Laws are designed to tell you what you can't do. So the fact that there is no law in America that says you may do something, that doesn't make any sense. The law is not, our laws tell you what you can't do, not what you can do. There's no law saying that I can go to the store and get a slice of pizza,
I'm not
because
talking
that's
about
what
our
I
laws.
can do. There's a law that says I can't steal a slice of pizza.
Uh-huh.
So you're
So
conflating the
there's a
laws
law.
that in
There's a
in
law in the
in that
Bible
case.
that says if I want to take a captive as a wife, then I will make it happen simply by my desire to make it happen. That means
Sure,
that
but
she cannot
you,
decline the offer.
how do you know that?
Because it says,
You're
if
assuming
I
that.
want it, it shall be done.
You're
End of
assuming that.
story.
What if I say you may go to the store, Snake, and buy a cake? I'm not then suggesting that you can go steal the cake. I said you may go buy the cake. You're assuming assuming nefarious motives that I actually mean, hey, you can go beat the person up, rape them, and take the cake from them. You don't see that
Nope.
assumption that you're making.
This is a complete straw man.
Okay, you're assuming because it says the man may go marry her. He may take wives. You're assuming he may take a piece of cake. You're assuming that he may take it by force. That's your assumption. You're not seeing it.
Because it says if he
You have
wants it,
scales
it
over
shall
your
happen.
eyes.
If he wants it, it shall happen.
If I
which
want the cake,
means
I shall have it. That
under
doesn't
all
mean that I'm forcing it.
circumstances,
That doesn't
it
mean that I'm
means
stealing it.
under all circumstances, if he wants it, it shall happen. So that means if she doesn't want it, but if he wants it, it shall still happen.
That's an assumption you're making.
Nope.
Again,
That's
if
what it
I
says.
want a piece of cake, I shall have it. Don't assume then that I'm going to stick up and rob the store.
No,
that's
that
your
means
assumption.
that under all circumstances, that cake shall be yours. Just
That's your
because you want it.
assumption.
No,
Right,
that's
but
what it
that
says.
doesn't mean in all cases you're making that assumption. That's your
If that
assumption.
is the stipulation, if you want it, it shall be yours.
Yes,
That
if you
means that the
want to
only
marry them,
condition,
you can marry
hold
them.
on. That means that it said the only condition to marry or to have the cake, for the example, is that you want it. If that condition is
that
met,
is the
it shall
yes.
happen. That means
If
that
she
her
wants it,
consent is irrelevant.
if she wants it and you don't want it, it's not happening. So again, there are other scenarios of trying to make this dichotomy. It's a false one. So the man
There's
simply,
nothing dichotomous about it.
God is simply telling the man that if you want to marry these women, you may marry them. It's not, you
No.
don't then assume then that it's being done by force. That's your assumption that you'll never make or never prove rather, but just keep making.
I already proved it because the only condition that needs to be met is his desire. Therefore, it doesn't matter
That's
what her
false.
desire is.
That's your
It doesn't
assumption.
matter. No, that's what it says.
That's
If you
not what
desire
it
it,
says.
it shall happen.
If I desire pizza, it shall happen.
Right.
Does that mean that I still take the pizza by force?
If that is the holy law of God, then your desire is the only condition.
Well, that's
that
not
needs to
the
be
holy
met.
law of law. That's the problem you have with reading the Bible. You're trying to isolate one passage and interpret
says-
an entire ethical morality of the Jews based off one passage. The Bible also
this
says
whole chapter.
not to mistreat the sojourner, not to mistreat widows or orphans, basically those who are less fortunate than you, like war survivors. Okay, so the Bible does give instruction for how you are to treat people. You can't
this
take one verse and try to twist it with your assumptions
This isn't
into
just
something
the
that it
Bible.
doesn't say.
This isn't just the Bible. This is the God of the Bible speaking in his own words.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
this is the holy law of laws.
And also what we about the Hittites had also these Suzerain-Vassal treaties. The law was organized into a style from that period. So
And the Nazis had a treaty with Italy. Who cares? It was still wrong.
So the book of Deuteronomy was written in the style of a Hittite Suzerain-Vassal treaty. So but that's not to assume that all of their stipulations are the same as the stipulations in the Hebrew text or in Deuteronomy. Okay, for example, the Hittites did not have any treatment or protection for slaves. If you read the Code of Hammurabi,
well, we've already agreed that regulation
in the Old
of slavery,
Testament there is no punishment for slaves or for workers.
We've already agreed that regulation of slavery is still slavery. So the fact that there is better and worse slavery around the world is completely irrelevant.
Well, now that we've demonstrated that you have no evidence of forced labor, I can now talk about the difference. And one of the differences is that you could not force them to work. If you were caught kidnapping and forcing someone to work against their will, even if you had sold them off to someone else, you were still put to death. So now that we established that you don't have any grounds for forced labor overall, that's the umbrella in which all these other laws are under.
Okay,
we can now talk about the differences.
So the fact that you can own these people for life as property, and you can beat them, means that you can force them to work for you to do pretty
If
much
if
anything.
they want to be owned for
Nope, it
life,
doesn't say that.
they would pierce
It does
their ear.
not say that. It
It
says you
does say
can
that.
buy
Yes,
them. You can buy them from the territories around you, and they will become your property. It does not say
right,
anything about their consent. You buy
right.
them. They have no consent in
Well, you
this.
mentioned for life. That was another passage in which
Yep.
if the slave
They're not
wants to
allowed to
be
leave for
with
life.
his master, he will pierce his ear and he will
Stop
become his
lying.
master for
Stop
life.
lying. This is for
That's the
Israelite
passage we're
slaves
talking
only.
about, life.
Stop
Okay,
lying.
you're quoting
You
another
know,
passage of scripture. You're mixing
this is
two
all
passages.
Leviticus 25. You know, this is within like 2 or 3 passages of one another.
Right. You
So
again,
it
okay,
says,
can you
you
bring
can
up
buy
Leviticus?
You can
Right.
buy
Can
some of
you
the temporary residents living among you, or
can you
slaves from the nations around you. They will become
right.
your property. But then a couple verses later, it says, for Israelite slaves, they will go free in the year of Jubilee, or they will, or if they want to stay a slave, they can.
Yeah, how much time do we have?
But
Let me pull up
that is still entrapment, because you're holding their wife and children captive. So that is
let
still
me pull up
forced labor.
let me pull up the trapment. Let me pull up the entire passage. So this is an actual contract. Okay, this is something that two parties would agree to. This isn't something that's being forced on anyone else or any party. Both parties are agreeing. They would enter into these contracts, these suzerain relationships with the
It
vassal.
does not
There
say
were
that.
rules for the covenant. Okay, you're reading one verse and expecting us to get an idea of what the culture was doing. That's an absurdity.
I
Okay,
cited dozens of verses.
you cited double this is the verses out of context. Okay, all right. So I want to pull
Most of
up
them are right
Leviticus
next to each other, so they put each
right
other in
next to each other.
context.
Okay. All right. So let's keep reading. Um, I want to
Where does
read.
it say
Can
consent
we?
is necessary? All I need to show is that consent is not necessary. If it's not necessary, then it doesn't matter what the other person consents or not. I can just do it anyway. If I want it, I can do it.
Okay, well let me share my screen. I want to share with you more of what the actual Leviticus 25 says, because if you read all of Leviticus 25, you'll learn that the foreigner there, the quote unquote slave there, actually becomes rich. So if this is an oppressive situation in which the slave didn't want to be there, in which he was being forced. This is Leviticus. Here, I'll show it. I'll prove it to you. See,
It
when you
does
read
not
the
say
whole
that
book,
slaves become rich. It just says
Leviticus
foreigners who
25.
live with you.
Yeah, this is Leviticus 25. All right, so all of these passages have to do with voluntary um,
You already
transactions,
had it
business
up.
transactions, right? Houses,
Yeah, like the
here,
selling and buying of humans,
property,
right? Yep.
right? If you become poor and unable to support yourselves, you can, um, work as a servant. Okay. Um, Here, and this is verse 37. If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, well, how did he become rich if he's being forced to work without pay? Up in verse 44.
It doesn't say all foreigners have to be
It-
slaves.
right. So how does this
What are you
slave
talking
become?
about?
How does he become rich?
By
How does the
trading? I don't
foreigner
know.
become rich in Israel?
Being a merchant? I don't know. Trading
Okay.
slaves, maybe, as
If
it says
he's
you can
trading
do in the Bible.
slaves, okay, which is not found. There's no evidence of any taskmasters or bands of slaves, Israelite slave masters running around kidnapping people. You won't find that anywhere in the text. All right, because that's not what's going on. If a
Actually,
foreigner
well,
residing
then
among
they
you,
wouldn't have needed to have a law against kidnapping, which I proved conclusively with several
well,
scholars that it is legally distinct from slavery. Just because we today understand slavery as kidnapping, you are taking the word out of context and you are gaslighting everybody, because we know that kidnapping is illegal in several slave owning societies. So
okay,
how is
so
that true?
that's why you need to read Leviticus 18 and 19, where it talks about what these lands around them were doing. So the reason why we had these laws is because God did not want them practicing what a Hittite would practice when it came to work. They would force people to work against their will, and that's why it's important to look at both of these all of these Suzerain-Vassal treaties and compare them in light of each other. I don't think you've done that. I don't think you've researched any scholarship on this issue. But these people,
I have. That's why all the scholars I cited disagree.
You cited scholars?
Well, going back one point, there is Matthew Henry talks about how magistrates and creditors traded slaves at the time. That's a historian.
And what's your evidence that they were doing that against their will?
You don't trade and sell people by their will.
Yes, you do. Even today,
no,
I cited several scholars.
No, that is a lie.
That type of language. Can you define what the Hebrews meant by purchase? Can you define what they meant by purchase?
Yeah, they were treated as property. The Bible explicitly says they're treated as property.
Right. Can you define what they meant by property?
Well, seeing as how these are translated, they didn't say property. Property is an English word. So all you have to do is type in the definition of property, which is a thing belonging to someone or a possession.
Okay, so that's your definition.
Was one of the definitions of slavery.
That's your definition of property. Can I read to you what the Hebrew definition of property is?
As long as you give context of where you got this from.
The Hebrew understanding of property was not, as Dr. Paul Capan put it, not a restricted one. It was not one that precluded their, a loss of their humanity, or included a loss of their dignity or their freedom.
What are you talking about? The American Slave Code said that slaves shall be treated with dignity too.
They were hired workers.
It's just filler work. They were hired workers. So why does the Bible in Leviticus 25 verse 50 make a distinction between slaves and hired workers?
What's that? I'm sorry.
Leviticus 25 verse 50 says there is a distinction between slaves and hired workers.
There's a distinction between, what's that distinction? Is it one is being forced and the other is being not forced? That's the distinction you have to demonstrate. So what's the Suzerain treaty?
So let's do a thought experiment.
Treaty? Yes.
Let's do a thought experiment. Treaty. You are a Israelite slave who is bound to a master until the next Jubilee. And you just sit around picking your nails all day. Is he just going to let that go?
I'm not sure what you're asking. Why am I there?
Or is the master going to beat that slave and force him to work?
First and foremost, which again,
is that an absurd situation? Is what I'm asking.
What you want
to say?
I'm trying to answer you. I'm trying to answer you. What you're ignoring is, how did I end up there in the first place? That's what you've been ignoring the entire debate. You're not going to be able to deal with volition because you can't demonstrate it being violated in the text. So how did I wind up in that situation in the first place, working for someone else?
Yeah, you can, because it says nothing about so it actually says that hired workers are different from both foreign slaves and Israelite slaves. It says Israelites sell themselves.
Going back to your scenario,
debt servitude is still slavery, because it's because there is an undefined amount of work. You can't work your off the debt in debt slavery.
You go all over the place. Let's stay focused.
Hold on. Because it's time based. So he can make you do whatever he wants until the time runs out, which is why it's an abuse of debt.
Okay, going back to your scenario.
And this is different from the slaves who are bought from among you.
1 minute remaining.
It does not say that they sell themselves. It says you bought them. So consent is not necessary. That's all I need to show.
Yeah, the definition of purchase in the text that we're reading, the primary meaning is create, as was declared in Cain's birth. The it doesn't denote a oppressive situation. All right. So these were not oppressive situations. These were transactions that people would make voluntarily. They would actually perform ceremonies, as I demonstrated in the Suzerain-Vassal tradition. So you can
But
try
again,
to claim
that
that there's some nefarious motives or people are being forced, but you can't demonstrate that from scholarship or the text.
I've demonstrated that force is allowed and that consent is not necessary. So that's all I need to do. And
And time.
this treaty that you keep saying is between two states, not between an individual person and another individual person.
Actually,
Thank you, Snake. That's time.
Okay.
All right, guys. Did you want closing statements, or were we not doing closing statements?
We were going to do closing.
How long?
5 minutes each.
Sure, that's fine. I believe since Snake went first, Jill should be able to go first for their closing statement.
Okay, I'll go first for my closing. Thank you for having me on once again. I'm so glad that you gave me this opportunity, this platform. So what did we learn today? We learned that there's a lot more going on in the text. That when we're entering into the biblical text, we need not to put on our 21st century feminist, male feminist eyeglasses or sunglasses. These were treaties. You may consider them to be unequal treaties, but they were unequal parties, and that was the point. Okay, but whether they're unequal or not is not demonstrating that one side is being forced. Just like Snake could not demonstrate that the wife of the Vietnam veteran forced her when he grabbed her and threw her onto the transport vehicle, right? We don't consider that to be slavery, but we know that these things happen in war. So the more powerful party is the suzerain, whether it is a landowner, as I said in my opening, or whether it is a government official or king. Okay, and the vassal would be the less powerful. Okay, that ranges across all spectrums and all culture or all levels of what we would call society: middle class, upper class, right, elite, right. So the parties are also sometimes referred to as father and son. So the lord and servant, king and vassal. So the lesser party must show submission to the suzerain, because the suzerain's job was to rule and to protect. Okay, so if you're going to point to warfare and Bible and treaties, in the Bible, I think it's only fair we point to treaties in our culture and other cultures, but that doesn't mean that there's a one-to-one correspondence between the two. So animals are being slaughtered for a reason. These are ceremonies that are being performed. Obviously, both parties know what's happening. No one is being fooled. No one is being tricked. These treaties are preserved in what they call the Mari tablets. They're also preserved in collections, other collections, other ancient Near Eastern collections. So these types of treaties between kings were common, but just like in our culture, there's contracts that are made between governments, and then on a much lower scale, there are contracts that are made between citizens. The same was the case in their culture. So that's completely false to say that this only dealt with governments, right, or governments taking over other governments. These were traditions of the land, just like we have a tradition in our land. So there were blesses and curses. There were rules of the covenant. Again, we like to concentrate on the vassal because the vassal is the one that's the lesser ruler. That doesn't mean he's oppressed. Just because he's not getting what the Suzerain is getting and out of the deal doesn't mean volition is being violated. All right. Because remember, the Suzerain has to protect the vassal. So he's the one spending the resources to protect the vassal states. Right. And warfare, we mean. Okay. So there's a lot more going on in this
1 minute
text
remaining.
than what we might normally think when we read this Bible. Okay, thanks again for having me on. The Bible does not promote slavery. The Bible denounces slavery as sin, both in the Old Testament and New Testament. The New Testament goes as far as to put slave traders in the same category as homosexuals, adulterers in First Timothy, and liars. So slavery within the Old Testament was sanctioned due to economic realities rather than racial prejudices or sexual sexism, racism, homophobicism. So because bankruptcy laws didn't exist, people would voluntarily sell themselves
Time.
into servitude. Okay. Thank you for having me on again, Snake.
All right, Snake, are you ready?
Yes, just make me larger, or I can do that.
No one can make you larger but you, Snake.
Well, some people,
That's not how consent works.
just their mere presence. Okay, so I'm not looking at anything through a feminist lens. I'm a libertarian, so all I need to show is that force is allowed and that consent from slaves is not necessary. I don't have to show any particular case of forced labor. I just have to show that it's allowed to force, which is one of the things that beating the slaves shows, and that consent is not necessary from the enslaved, from the bride. The only condition that matters is that the buyer or the captor wants it. So as for the Vietnam vet, I don't know if he was allowed to marry her without her consent or not. But in the case of Israel, we have that legal code, and it says no, the consent not necessary. The only necessary condition is his desire. So, and I don't know why you keep going on about Suzerain and vassals. This is not a contract between individuals, which is where consent actually comes from. There's such thing as collective consent. The Bible does not denounce slavery anywhere, but we'll get to that. So let's recap. Let's see. Sorry, I just got a little confused there. So you went on about kidnapping. Kidnapping, I showed several sources, including the Bible itself. Actually, in the original, so the Exodus version actually says, whoever kidnaps a person, whether that shall be put to death. But the original, actually, or the translation in Greek actually says that translates it as children of Israel. And later in Deuteronomy, it says kidnapping the children of Israel. So the Bible itself is clarifying that kidnapping is only prohibited for children of Israel. I also showed that there were several other countries, including Rome and the United States, that outlawed kidnapping and allowed slavery. So this is not a point against, this is not the Bible speaking out against slavery, just kidnapping of free Israelites. There is the pulpit commentary and Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges that say that it's expressly limited to Israelites. Let's see. God is not against slavery. He never says anything against slavery. Slavery is only allowed because of time and place. We didn't really get to talk about that. He did not refute that. Slavery meant something different back then. It does not. I conclusively demonstrated that this is a case of owning a human or forcing them to work, which is his definition of slavery. So we showed that slavery was not just a form of employment, because there is an actual explicit distinction between slavery, between hired workers and slaves. He a couple times tried to pass this lie off that they always try to do, which is to say that slaves are freed in the Jubilee. Well, no, this is only a certain type of slave, not foreign slaves. I don't know why you were saying that all foreigners living in Israel were slaves, but that's not the case. You bought slaves outside of Israel, from outside of Israel. And here's the point about the Bible saying no kidnapping. It does not matter if it's against kidnapping, because kidnapping was not considered the same thing as slavery in the Bible, in any ancient society, and even in America less than 200 years ago. These were legal distinctions.
1 minute remaining.
I understand morally slavery is the same as kidnapping, but that's not the legal code put out in the Bible or in all of these slave owning societies, because they are hypocrites. That's the thing about slave owners. Slavery is slavery. You don't get off the hook just because there's less or more brutal versions of slavery. So all forms of slavery are completely unacceptable. There is sex slavery in the Bible, and forced labor slavery in the Bible. And we didn't get time to address fugitive slaves, but that was the Bible does not say that it doesn't say anything wrong about slavery.
Okay, so Demolish, is there a way for you to communicate with me privately?
All right, so first question, praise I am. Can Snake supply citation? These supposed slave laws mentioned in the Pentateuch were prescriptive and normative laws. If you want me to read them again, I'm not sure where your objection to them being prescriptive is, because it's God saying you shall do this. They shall be your wives. They shall be slaves for life. So yeah, if you wanted to put in the chat, or if Jill wants to address where the contention of why that's not prescriptive is, go ahead.
These were case laws. They were not laws that are prescriptive. So they're contracts that you would make with someone entering into their land, and it's rules to be on someone else's land, basically. And there were also blessings and curses that were involved with these covenants or relationships. So it would be like me and you making a business deal. We get to really decide what the stipulations are, more so than the government, right? We want less government interference. So that's basically what we have going on in the ancient Near East.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you think prescriptive means, or where you get the fact that these are individual contracts. This was just the general law of the land. So, and you could take people from outside your land and just take them back to your land with you. So, and there's absolutely no mention of recourse for them, other than if you beat them to death within 2 days. If it's 3 days, you're fine because you lost money.
Yeah, you can use language like take, but you'll never be able to demonstrate that that was a taking by force.
They are not given a choice. They are bought and they are made slave for life. They are given no way of escaping it.
And then they become
and they
rich.
can be beaten.
47.
So threats of beating is force.
And yeah, well, there's a lot to be unpacked with that passage. I don't even think I got it to that, but no, that's not a beating, because the slave did something wrong, and because he's a slave, that's what he did wrong, right? So he's not being arrested because he's black, right? He's doing something. He's violating the law. So because he's violating the law, there needs to be punishment enacted. And there were
Okay,
rules as to what
that's
that punishment would be.
being convicted in a court of law is different from your master just beating you.
No, that's actually how they actually adjudicate it. The
With
master,
with three men to each other. No, the
it would be-
master
it
did
would
not
be
have to go through court to beat his slave.
the elders would be the court, basically. In ancient times, they didn't have courthouses like we do today. Okay, the elders would be the court. So you would bring the accuser or the defendant and the plaintiff would come before the elders and they would adjudicate. So these are just case laws. They would not always adjudicate in the same way when it came to other scenarios. So I
Free
think
man
that's
to free man.
thing.
A master did not need a trial to beat his slave. He needed a trial if he beat him to
You
death.
can assume that.
All
You
right,
can assume that.
kids, break it up.
All right.
We got
Next
your
question. Well, I mean,
Hey,
why
Mark
not?
reads in the chat.
This is for praise. I'm not sure that's relevant here.
All war is according to Mark Reed.
Let's see. These have been flagged, so I'm not sure. I haven't reviewed them myself. A's philosophy says, I've heard people make the argument slave portions of the Bible are manipulations or edits that weren't part of God's original revelation. Also, some question about the authority of Paul. So that would, and then it gets cut off.
That's A's philosophy. He's part of the Leviathan gang who deny Paul's authority and his calling. I don't even think that's relevant to the debate, but that's not even a question.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would comment on there is it seems to me that those parts of the Bible are not actually the words of a God, but actually the words of humans trying to justify their own greed and ignorance. So I guess I would agree that they're manipulations or edits in a sense. Dean Kruger asks, I wonder if Jill would be okay with being a slave under the laws of the Bible.
Yes, I would. Yes. I would certainly want to work. I love work. I love my job. But I would want to work for someone who was rich. So not you. So don't ask me if, like Matt Dillahunty, would you be my slave? No, not you, Matt, because you don't have any land that I would actually inherit, that I would actually wax rich like the slave, quote unquote, in Leviticus 25. He became rich, and then he started hiring his own workers, the text says in verse 47. So yes, I would, but it depends on who you are. If you're Bill Gates, oh, sign me up. Sure, certainly.
But are you factoring in the fact that you can't choose your owner and you can't choose to leave if something goes wrong?
That wouldn't be biblical slavery. That would be against biblical slavery and punishable by death.
Even though it says you could be made a slave for life.
If you want to be. If I want to be there for
and
life.
And if you want to stay with your wife and kids, you have to agree to be a slave for life.
If I want to stay with my wife and kids, we have to look at that text together. It sounds like you're bringing up, I can't remember the passage, but we'll have to look at that text again some other time. Unless you want to look at it now, that's up to you. I mean, we can have an after show or after whatever party.
We can do this again. We can do a discussion.
Yeah, we can look at those passages individually.
All right. Melody Joy asks, why was war needed in the first place?
Why was war needed in the first place? Well, Leviticus 18 and 19, which I brought up earlier in the discussion portion, outlines why God felt it was necessary to go to war with these nations. They were practicing abominable acts, such as killing their own children, sacrificing their own children, not before they're born, like some of us do today, but after they were born, which you might deem to be immoral still. So God sent in an army to wipe out those leaders, those kings, those queens. Most of the battles in the Old Testament were battles against the enemy's strongholds, their military strongholds. Okay, that's what Jericho is all about. Jericho is a military stronghold. Read the story of Joshua and Caleb, mighty Joshua. going up against the Amalek and the false gods of Canaan. So that's what the whole point was. So it wasn't just a land grab. It was really a rescue mission.
So you said that they went and took out the leaders and kings of those nations, but in fact, God commands them to slaughter every last man, woman, and child in many cases. That doesn't seem like an act of self-defense to me. And God literally says on dozens of occasions that the Israelites are just as wicked as the nations around them. The only reason he's sparing them is because he made a covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, for example, Deuteronomy 9:4-8 is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going to take possession of their land. And he also says, I will accomplish what I swore to your fathers. So, it says at the end, it says, at Horeb, you aroused the Lord's wrath so that he was angry enough to destroy you. Later on in that same chapter, this occurs everywhere. The Deuteronomy 10, lead the people on their way so that they may enter and possess the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. So this is literally a land grab for people whose only excuse, they are just as wicked as everyone else, and their only excuse is, I made a covenant with you, so I'm giving you a loophole. He says, I abhor the Israelites so much as to destroy them completely. But he made a covenant with them. So Numbers 25, 2 Kings 17, Exodus 32, all describes the God of the Bible talking about how the Israelites are just as evil. They're idolaters. He wants to destroy them, but he won't because he made a covenant with Abraham to give them land. And that's it. That's why war was needed. And the people wanted to stop them from taking their land. So,
Well, you'd have to totally ignore the verses that speak on God's decrees, basically declaring war. You'd have to ignore all of those that only concentrate on the ones that say, I'm going to give you the land. Yeah, I'm going to give you the land because the people in the land, the text says, are basically poisoning the land. That the behaviors that they were practicing, homosexuality, bestiality, were actually poisoning the land, the text says. So that's why God had to send in a rescue team to free the land from these people who were defiling the land. He uses the term defile.
But he explicitly said that the Israelites are no better. They're just as wicked. It is not because you are righteous that I'm going to let you take possession of the land. He says it's only because I made a covenant with Abraham.
Right. Yeah. So the God can make a promise to you and at the same time punish someone else who breaks his promise. So for instance, when the Israelites were given a promise, someone else was breaking God's law. So God took away the land from that person and gave it to those who he gave the promise to. Remember later then when the Israelites began to mess up and began to break some of the covenants, God never broke the Suzerain-Vassal covenant, by the way. He never broke his end of the covenant. All right. When they broke the end, remember, God is the vassal. God is the suzerain king, and we are the Israelite is the vassal. Right. So when you're reading the text, you have to keep that in mind. So blessings for those who follow, curses for those who don't follow. If you understand Suzerain-Vassal law, you understand what's going on in the Old Testament. If not, then you're lost. Then you're just trying to figure it out as you go. So those people, when Israelite messed up, he took the land away from them and gave it to who? Someone else. So that's the same thing is going on. So it doesn't matter who you are. God doesn't play favorites. If you obey him, he'll bless you. He'll give you the land, even if he has to take it from someone else. They're being cursed because they're disobeying.
Yeah, they were constantly cursed. He sent plagues. He killed them because of the Israelites' sexual immorality, because of their idolatry. They were doing the same things as the people around them. And God was not rewarding them when they took over the Israelite land, he was just punishing Israel extra hard because he was even more mad at them than
Right.
the people around them.
Right, because
And
they knew better.
they were their special children.
Yeah, they knew better. God,
Mm.
he got them through Egypt or away from Pharaoh. He rescued them. They should have known to trust God more so than the other nations who were already worshiping foreign gods. And they were breaking God's laws, and they knew they were breaking God's laws, but they weren't the ones that God called out of that.
Yeah, the only reason he didn't completely destroy them, as he said he wanted to multiple times, was because of the covenant, not because of their righteousness, not
Because
because
of
of their
Christ.
obedience. It was
Right,
never
because
that. He even compared Israel to a whore that was being that he allowed to be gang
Mhm.
raped by the
Right,
opposing nations.
right, because of Christ. Yeah. So God kept Israel safe and did not punish them to the full extent of his judgment because their time had not come. The Bible speaks of when a nation commits sin. At some point, the God of the Bible says, "Okay, the cup is full now. Now I have to pour out my wrath." So God waited 400 years before He judged the cities of Canaan. He waited 400 years, and He gave them time to repent. And now their time was up. It was time for God to release His judgment. God is a just God. He's going to pay back all injustice, and he used the Israelites as the acts of his judgment, which is his prerogative to do.
Lovely. So Peter W. asks, I don't know why this is discussed so much. Nobody thinks Christians today are taught to enslave people today, do they? It's probably directed towards me. And it's discussed because it's in the actual text. And there are Christians who say that the Bible is literally the Word of God. So if you're saying, if you come to me and say, look, this part of the Bible is written by men who were corrupt, who just wanted to say that God approved of their institution of slavery, it was just the men of this time using God as an excuse, I will accept that. But the Bible still endorses it. You may have an argument to say God didn't endorse it. It was just the humans saying it, but the document of the Bible still endorses it. And that is a problem because it is considered a holy document. And I am very glad that most Christians today do not take the Bible literally, and they do this in spite of the Bible, not because of it. Thoughts, Jill?
We're not taught the Bible had to be perverted. And I brought it. My first slide was the slave Bible. So I didn't ask Snake this question, but I often ask atheists if this book already condoned slavery in of itself, why did the slave master feel as though he had to remove verses like Exodus 21:16, which says if you kidnap someone and even if you were to sell them, so it's not just about kidnapping. Snake ignored the second clause of the verse where it says if you sell them, even if you sell them to someone else. So obviously more than just kidnapping is going on. If someone kidnaps a young girl, we just don't say she was kidnapped, right? If she's sold into sex trafficking, or they're trying to sell them to someone else, we call that sex trafficking, not kidnapping. So the text says if you steal someone, even if you sell them to someone else, you're still put to death, even if you're found without them in your possession, because you kidnapped them to sell them. That is called that is called slave trafficking, which was punishable by death.
So I already addressed that multiple times. So the Bible is talking about kidnapping of free Israelite citizens, not the legal practice of kidnapping foreigners and selling them. And it says kidnap and sell. So I went over the fact that there's a legal distinction between kidnapping free citizens and trading slaves. These are different concepts. And
we didn't get a citation for that notion, and we never will.
Yeah, I cited the American Slave Code. I cited the
American
Roman Slave Code.
The Roman
I cited Cambridge Bible for schools and colleges. They say man stealing, where the present law is merely expanded and recast in the Deuteronomic phraseology. That's also a reference to the fact that Deuteronomy clarifies that it is, quote, this is from Cambridge Bible School, Deuteronomy expressly limited kidnapping to an Israelite.
Yeah, you're ignoring the fact that the passage is found in Exodus, not Deuteronomy, and it's talking about kidnapping. It says if you kidnap anyone, not just an Israelite or a non-Israelite, but anyone, even if you were to sell them, even if they were found no longer in your possession, which is denoting slave trafficking, all right, you were still put to death. So you're going to Deuteronomy. The text is found in Exodus, where it's talking about illegal slave trading or slave trafficking.
Yeah, right, exactly. It's talking about illegal slave trafficking. So I asked you earlier in the debate, just because there are limitations on slave trading doesn't mean slavery is not still practiced, and you agreed with that. So there are there are some people who it is illegal to trade as slaves. However, there are other people who it is legal to trade as slaves. And
You
so
haven't
if
demonstrated
you
that.
say that this is a polemic against all kidnapping and all slavery, but then the Bible is contradicting itself, because that is from
You haven't
Exodus
produced a
21.
verse,
Not 5 verses later, it says you can beat your slaves into
right?
submission.
But you haven't
So
produced a verse where
is the
that's
Bible
the case.
contradicting itself there? Because it
You
says
need to produce. You would need to negate what I said about the scriptures telling us that kidnapping anyone, even if you were to sell them to someone else, if you were found doing that, you would be put to death. You cannot find anywhere where that is allowed to any other person or to any human being, period. That was never allowed, regardless of where you were from, whether you were a sojourner or whether you were an Israelite. You were not allowed to kidnap anyone and force them into servitude or sell them as a slave. That's called man stealing, and it was punishable by death. So the burden is on you to
man
prove
stealing.
that's the case, that you were allowed to do that if you were a foreigner. The burden of proof is on you. I've cited several passages which says you are not to treat the foreigner that way or to oppress them.
Unless you bought them legally as a slave. That was the loophole.
That would be
it
buying
says,
someone as a slave
I
against their
cited
will would not be legal.
I cited
according to the
Cambridge.
text.
So there is a difference between who you can legally trade as a slave and who you cannot. We agree on that.
There's
And we
no such
agreed
thing as a legal
that
slave.
it is
where
still slavery if some people are not allowed to be traded as slaves. So Cambridge Bible for Schools and Colleges agrees with me. I cited them. The Pulpit Commentary talks about man stealing.
man stealing
Most
was
kidnapping
right.
was of foreigners, and this was a practice of which the laws and states took no cognizance.
Right.
So this is the context of the time. This was the legal code of the time.
Right. So you
and the Bible itself clarifies this.
Okay, you need to demonstrate that there is anything going on here that is of an involuntary nature. Just simply saying, well, they're being purchased is not proof that they were being purchased against your will. So you can assume that and read that into these texts and take what they're saying out of context. But there's nothing in the text itself to suggest that's the case. I can just well assume they're coming by volition or by choice.
I don't know what you think it means when it says you shall buy slaves from the nations around you and they shall become your property for life. I'm not sure what you think.
That. It means that
how you reconcile that. Hold on. I'm not sure how you reconcile that with
easily. They're coming because they want to come. They're not coming by force. You're assuming they're coming by force.
No, because there are sojourners.
There are sojourners. That's a traveler.
Who are allowed to travel. No, they're allowed to travel and work in Israel without being a slave. So why are some of them being bought as slaves and not allowed to leave? They're slaves.
Where does it say they weren't allowed to leave? You're making that assumption.
Slave for life.
Slave for life can be a slave for life if he wants to be a slave for life.
It doesn't say
that.
Assume.
Yes, it does. It says that he can actually pierce his ear if he wants to be loyal to his master. Read the text.
That is
okay,
for Israelites.
Let me get you the passage, and I'll quote you the scholar. All right, this is Dr. J. Alec Moyer. He says Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only of servitude. That was the point. They're servants, they're volunteering. These were the conditions. The conditions were he wanted to be there. That was the first and foremost condition. If that condition wasn't met, you've already violated Exodus 21:16.
And this is kind of a question related to what we were just talking about. Did you have the option to go work somewhere else?
Did I have the option to, what is that? What do you mean? What does that mean?
Did servants or aveds have the option to go work somewhere else?
Oh, of course. That they were obligated. The rules of the covenant were laid out in the treaty or in the relationship. So breaking this relationship, remember the oath that they would both say. They would walk together hand in hand, and they would say this oath that if any of us, like they're walking in between an animal that's been cut in half and there's blood everywhere, right? And they would say to each other in their own languages, even if they spoke a different language, they would speak their language, all right? Or they would even have their gods there and they would swear to their gods. And they would promise that if I don't uphold this covenant, may what happened to this animal happen to me. So in their time, they weren't looking to get out of debt like we are today. We signed a credit card agreement and it's 30 APR, 30% APR, and we sign it anyway. And then we cry and complain that, to the Democrats or to Bernie to get you out of the debt, right? That wasn't the case in ancient times. They actually had integrity in that if they had a debt and they had an agreement, they were bound to it. They actually believed it and kept those covenants.
But the difference there is debt in modern society can be paid off. Debt in this ancient Israelite society even the Hebrew servants were not, could only be like their debt did not, their redemption was not based on their debt. It was based on how much you would pay an actual hired worker until the next Jubilee. So there's a huge distinction between actual employees and these servants. So I don't know where you get that you have the option to go work somewhere else. Because it never says that you do.
You wouldn't, though. You wouldn't take that option because you upheld the covenant. So Hebrew debt or servanthood could be compared more so to conditions in colonial America. So like paying for a favor to America was too costly for most individuals. So they would contract themselves out, working in people's houses, often in apprentice-like positions, so until they pay back their debts. And both parties would decide on what that actually meant. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So that was all part of their agreement. And two people were making an agreement, to voluntary contractual, what we would call a contractual agreement between two willing parties. Nothing illegal about that or immoral.
I just don't see that anywhere in the text. The text actually says that they are inherited property, slaves for life, and then it says, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. It says nothing about that for the foreign slaves. So it's clearly making a distinction between them. And the thing about debt slavery that I don't think you addressed or even understand is why it's slavery is because it takes this finite debt and makes it into like this infinite, like now you are just going to work for me for either a number of years or for life, as the Bible says for the foreigners. And you just get told to do whatever. There's no, okay, you worked this amount of hours, now I'm taking this off of your debt. There's no wanting to leave for another work. There's no buying yourself out. It's just an indefinite amount of labor for an indefinite amount of time. So that's an abuse of debt, and why it's slavery, why it's different from just simply being in normal debt.
Yeah, you haven't been able to demonstrate that. For one, you have to demonstrate.
Those are just the definitions.
Well, you have to be able to demonstrate that that's the case in the biblical text instead of just assuming that. Remember, if what you're doing is really is kind of dishonest, because you're taking a situation in which the slave said that he wanted to be there for life, and you're making that the case for all scenarios. Remember, the two parties are coming together, making a covenant, going through an entire ceremony, and they're really serious about it. It's not like us today. We make contracts and just, I just won't pay it. They really believed that a man's word was his bond, and they would actually do a blood covenant. So both parties are determining how long they want to serve. If I want to serve for a year, I serve for a year. If I want to serve for life, I serve for life. That's still my decision. It's not for us to come later and say, oh, he's a slave for life, he must have been forced. No, that's your assumption you're forcing onto the text.
Where does it say that you can choose to only be enslaved for a year?
You would voluntarily enter
doesn't.
into contractual agreements, and the two parties would determine themselves how they want to enter into the contract. So no one was being forced to work, and no one was being forced to purchase.
But you haven't substantiated that. So, for example, the
Leviticus
Hebrew
25.
servants were actually they were forced to work until the next Jubilee. So that's still an undefined amount of labor.
That's what they agreed to.
It's still an
They agreed to
undefined
that.
amount of labor.
That's the
It's
agreement.
not agreed to. You actually get put into like a debtor's ownership, and then you can be sold to different owners from that debtor. And you're ignoring the fact, and at this point, I think it's just intentional dishonesty, because you've been corrected so many times that only the Hebrews are given the chance to make the decision to be a slave for life. The foreigners are slave for life, period, full stop, end of story. Only Hebrews are given that option, and it is coerced because the slave owner owns the rest of their family. So that is entrapment. It's not a legitimate contract.
Okay. All right, so you can't prove that they're being forced, so now you want to say that they're coerced. Okay. The wife and the children might be sold to sustain the family through economical times.
Don't care.
If you
That's
want
immoral.
to say that they're being forced, they're being forced by their economic situation, not someone coming and kidnapping one of the kids and saying, hey, you better work for me. So you have to be able to demonstrate in that the text, not just a culture in which that can possibly be done in order to relieve the debt and sustain families through economic hard times.
Yeah, I already demonstrated that there are certain people you can kidnap and certain people you cannot kidnap.
You did? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'd like maybe I need to go back and listen to that one again. You haven't demonstrated. You assume that was the case, but you haven't demonstrated.
You invade foreign lands, take captive women. They have no choice in this.
How do you know that?
Kidnapping from our modern perspective. It's not legally kidnapping because it's legal to just take them.
You didn't assume that with the Korean War combatant or the Korean.
Why would I?
Soldier.
Why would I? If you showed me,
why would you assume that with the Jews?
Show me a law that says that you can do that. Then
laws are not made in the United States to tell you what you can do. Stop using that argument. It's not
actually there are
laws are designed to tell you what you can't do in America.
Right, and the law is
you're
that
comparing the apples and oranges when you're talking
you.
about Suzerain covenants and the law today.
So
our laws are different. They tell you what you can't do, not what you can do.
You're distracting from the fact that the Bible says that you can just force a woman to marry you.
It didn't say
force.
It
doesn't matter what happened in Korea.
It
doesn't matter what happened in Japan. It doesn't matter what happened in Norway or America, because we know that consent does not matter in the Bible.
You didn't prove that.
I did.
You did not prove that. You assume
that the only condition is that the man desires the captive, and thus it shall be so.
That's false. There are other conditions given in passages like Exodus 21. There are passages in Leviticus where it talks about you cannot oppress a sojourner because
we're not talking about sojourners.
So
but
these
also
if justice for the fatherless, the widows, and he loves the soldier. He gives them food and clothing in Deuteronomy 10. So these passages would have been in the mind of the Israelite when they were conquering these lands. The goal was to, just like when our soldiers go in, the goal is to protect the survivors of war, not to pillage and rape and do all those things.
So
Rape was
you
something that was illegal in Jewish law. It was against Jewish covenant law to rape a woman or a slave
so
or
you
a
are
captive or
who
captive.
is actually putting the modern interpretation onto words like oppress. So if the law allowed you to take captives and force them to be your wife, that was not considered oppression legally in
Yes,
that
it would have
society at
been.
that time, even though we consider that to be oppression.
No, it would have
It
been
does not
considered
say it
oppression
is
then.
not oppression because it is in fact legal.
It would have been considered against the law. War rape was prohibited in ancient Israel. That's according to scholars like Meredith Klein.
How
Uh,
can it be illegal if God
so,
himself says that it's allowed?
no, actually, you're interpreting a ceremony and a marriage to rape. So a ceremony, she had 1 month to mourning and she couldn't get away, I guess. And she said goodbye to her pagan life. She would denounce her false gods. She would join the camp of Israel now, and her family would be adopted through what's called manumission through adoption. So
So now you're
there's an
blaming the
idea
victim
in
because
which
she didn't
she's
escape.
protected
Okay.
in the
Rape
family of Israel now. And what else?
rape
She
is
didn't have
okay
much
as
of
long
a
as
choice.
she doesn't
So,
escape from you, right?
if she escaped, there you don't go after her and capture her. And there's no fugitive slave laws in Israel, so there's no extradition of a fugitive slave law. Runaway slaves were allowed to settle in Israel, according to scholars like Dr. Klein, Dr. David Klein, Dr. Meredith Klein. You were allowed to settle in any Israelite city if you were a escapee or a slave that had escaped a oppressive master. So Israel was a
Yeah.
hub for escaped slaves, basically.
So in Gill's commentary on the Bible, um, it's it says it cannot be thought that this law was made to encourage and protect every idle, disobedient, or fugitive slave. Only servants of idolaters, fleeing for the sake of religion, people of the heathens that fled because of worshiping of idols, were protected by this thing that you are referencing. And it also says the Jewish writers generally understand it as servants of idolaters fleeing for the sake of religion. Matthew Poole says this is
What point
not
did
to
you want
be
to make with that?
understood. This is
What point
not
did
to
you
be
want to make with
understood
that?
universally, as if all servants that flee their masters. That would be contrary to all laws of the religion. It would open a door to infinite disorders and mischiefs.
Okay, what
So
point did you want to make with those comments? Because they seem to support what I was saying. What point are you
they
trying to make?
support the precise opposite of everything you're saying. It says it is not
Um,
to be understood to protect slaves, runaway slaves universally. Would you like me to read it again? It
but
cannot be
does
thought
that
that this
demonstrate?
law was made to encourage and protect every idle, disobedient, or fugitive servant. So that's the
No, it's not.
precise,
No,
exact opposite of what you're saying.
only those who wanted to. Right, it was not something that was forced on to everyone who came into Israel. Only those who wanted to become a part of Israel would be adopted through manumission, and those would be they would contractually um, be for six
Right,
years. There would be their
right,
contract, and if
exactly.
they
So it
chose
does
to
not.
stay, then they can stay if they chose to. So you're ignoring volition, as if these people are being kidnapped or snatched off the streets of Canaan and being forced to work against their will. They're coming
Nope.
voluntarily.
What
They're
it
saying
says.
goodbye to their previous pagan life, and they're being adopted into the family of Israel.
No, thank you for agreeing with me that
That's how you agree.
slaves of Israelites who have already supposedly converted are not protected by this fugitive slave passage. It only applies to slaves who are coming from
There
idol
were
nations,
no fugitive
idol
slaves in
worshiping nations.
Israel. That's why there was no need for a
That
fugitive
is a
act to
lie.
protect Israel. There's no
There's
runaway slaves. People
absolutely
were
no
running
evidence of
to
that.
Israel to get freedom from that type of lifestyle. They were running
That's pretty
to
ridiculous.
Israel. They were settling in Israel, according to scholars who have
Uh-huh.
researched this issue, and they were allowed to settle in any Israelite city. That's in Exodus 21.
Only
This is all in the same Bible that you're reading.
only slaves from other nations who are now converting, but this does not apply to people who want to leave slavery. So you cannot just walk out on your slave master. You are forced to stay a slave.
People, again, you didn't want to walk out. See, this is the problem with
This is just
with
your
looking at.
fanciful, wishful
Hold on.
thinking.
This is a problem with trying to apply 21st century standards where people are looking to get
I'm
out of their
applying
obligations.
historical scholars and
Men
historical
then in that point, Snake, men in that time were not looking to get out of their financial obligations. They were looking to honor them. That's what the whole ceremony was about. It's serious to them. You're making it seem like everyone who has to work to pay off a debt is not proud to be there. They were proud, just like I get up and go to work. I'm proud to go to work.
That's
Even though
wishful
I'm being
thinking.
told what I'm to do for 8 hours by someone else, I voluntarily get up and go, and I'm proud. So
This is what Confederates
you can't look at
said about their slaves too.
you,
So that's
you
bullshit,
can't.
and you know it. And
Okay,
I
well
know
then
it, and we all know it.
you have to demonstrate otherwise. If you
No, I
can't
don't.
demonstrate
You have
otherwise,
to demonstrate your claim. You're
no,
claiming that every slave
you're
was
making the.
proud to be a slave. That's
I didn't
insane.
say that. I didn't say they were
You
proud.
said,
All slaves.
okay,
I said in their culture, it would have been something that they were proud of and something that they wanted to do. They would actually go through a ceremony. You don't go through a ceremony because someone is forcing you to be a slave.
yes, you do. He
That's not
owns your
how it
wife and
works.
children. He owns your wife and
So you
children.
don't
What are you going
you
to
don't
pick?
hold hands with that person and make a blood covenant with them and vow loyalty to them
That's
and
called
pierce
coercion.
their ear and say, I want to work for you for life. That's not something Kente, Toby, whatever his name is, Kuta Kente, that's not something he did. He never did that vow. They forced him to take that vow. They forced him to get that
Yeah.
tattoo. So
Holding your
you would
wife and
have to
children
demonstrate
captive is a form of coercion.
that never happens in the text. You never demonstrated
It
that from the
does. It
text.
says, I want to stay with my wife and child, and I will become a slave for life.
Thank you. Thank you. He is saying this is what I want. And
That's a
you
form of
that just went
coercion.
right over your head. He's
Nope.
saying he wants that.
Right. He's
That's
being
what he
coerced
wants.
because
So
he wants to stay with his wife, who is
where are you
a
reading
owned
this?
piece of property.
Yes.
So you don't
How did he
understand what
get the wife?
coercion is. So
How
you
did
don't
he get the
understand what
wife?
coercion is.
Okay. How did he get the wife?
It was given to him by the slave master.
Okay. So there is more going on here than just
human trafficking.
Human trafficking. There's more going on here. So since you brought it up in the debate, and I really didn't get a chance to respond to it, when it comes to the wife leaving the plantation, um, the the goal here is to really protect when it comes to these servants and these masters, is to protect both parties from injury, not just the vet. Okay. So the law here was designed to protect the property of the owner. So you couldn't come, for instance, you couldn't come to my land or my property or my plantation and marry 5 of my workers, because by doing so, you would be taking away from my production. So you had to compensate me in some way by either staying longer and working until her debt was paid off, right? If he had a wife when he came in, then the wife will go out with him. That means if he came in with his own wife, he did not take one of the wives from the employer's workforce, then he could leave and go out with his own wife, even if they have children. They can all leave together. But if the master gave him a wife and because the wife still owes the master, he cannot go out if he wants to go out, he has to go out by himself. Right? So
this is the problem with
that's
the
not a problem.
undefined
Let me tell you,
debt.
let me tell you why that's
he
not
just
a
owes
problem.
the master until further notice. That's
Yeah,
why
that's
it's slavery. That's why it's
it's not
immoral. That's why it's
slavery.
even
Here's why
trafficking.
it's not
That's why
slavery.
it's translated as slavery by all of the translators.
So
So
that's why
you
Exodus
don't
21 says,
understand what coercion is.
that's why 21 verse 21 says his master will pierce his ear with an awl. That's where you're getting that from. He actually volunteered to be there. So
No, he didn't,
you
because he's been
have to
coerced.
he did not, he is not being coerced. He came onto the owner's land and they had an agreement. You're ignoring the fact that this is a sojourner, most likely. This is
No, this
someone
is
who was
only for
traveling.
Israelites. This is
This is
only
only
for
for
Israelites.
Israel.
Get it through your head.
You haven't proven that.
I
I've,
showed
I've
the
showed you
text
several passages
several
where
times.
the same laws apply to the sojourner as it does the Hebrew
No,
living
you
in the
didn't.
land.
You did not.
All right, well, let me cite those passages again. It's in Exodus 12, verse 49. There shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you or who travels among you. One law. So they would have been
Yeah,
under the
one law
same
for
law.
the native and one law for the sojourners, as it
No,
says.
that's not what the text says. It says there shall be one law for both the
No, it
sojourner
doesn't.
and the one who is in Israel or the Israelite, the native.
Yeah, and it
Okay, there
gives
should be
different
one law,
laws.
not two laws, one law.
Nope, it does not.
That's
And
what
that's
Exodus
blatantly
12,
false
49
because it
says.
says when you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. But if you buy a slave from the nations around you, he shall be your slave for life. So either
Right.
your Bible
So
is lying and
where's
admit
that
that right now, that your
where is
Bible
that text at?
contradicts itself and
Can you
lies,
show us what text that
or
is?
let me finish talking, or admit that there are different laws.
Can you show us
Leviticus
that in the Bible?
Leviticus 25,
Okay,
44
let's
through
go there and
46.
share your screen for me, please. Share your screen because it doesn't say what you're trying to make it say.
I don't make it
And
say
what
anything.
does
It
it
just
say
says
again?
it.
Repeat what you said. It said again. What does the text say?
All right. It says, your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and you can make them slaves for life.
Okay, so
Then
you
it
can make
says,
them
hold on,
slaves.
I'm not
Hold on,
done.
hold on.
I'm not done.
Where
Then
did
it
they come
says,
from, and
then it
how do you
says,
know they came by force? Can you answer that?
then it gives different rules for Israelites
Before you get to the
down
different,
here.
how do you? Let's
And I'm
figure
not
out
done
where
yet.
they
I'm
came
not
from.
done. You asked me to show
You
the
don't want to deal with the
difference.
text.
I'm
I
not
want
done.
you
You
to
asked
show.
me to
I
show
want
the
you to prove to
difference.
me that you can show me that these people are being
I'm
forced to come to this
literally
nation.
not listening to anything you're saying because I'm still talking.
Okay,
So,
I'm still going to come back to that.
okay, that's fine. So we have the certain rule for the slaves bought from the nations around you, slaves for life. Then it starts talking about different rules for Israelites. And it says for Hebrew slaves, he will serve you for 6 years
Switching
or
to
until the
Exodus
year of the
20. Can we go
Jubilee.
to this? Can we stay in the same
So
passage?
these are different laws. This is Exodus.
Okay.
That was Exodus 21, but it also occurs in Leviticus 25 alongside the rules
Okay.
for
Can we go
foreign
back to
slaves.
Leviticus 25, please, and stay there and look and let's deal with this text because you're trying to combine different texts and then trying to create a narrative which is false. Let's deal with the actual text in Leviticus 25, please. Can we go back to Leviticus
We're
what's
there.
25? Okay. All right. So this is the 40. Okay, your male and female slaves shall come from the nations around you. Can you demonstrate that they're coming by force from the nations around them, the Israelites? Can you demonstrate that?
Yes, they're bought. So it says nothing
Right,
about them selling themselves. It says that for
they're bought.
Israelites. So
Right.
there's already a
So
difference there.
can you
And
demonstrate that the
also,
buying is
and
of an
also,
involuntary nature?
of course,
How?
because you can't buy people
Yes, you
voluntarily.
can. You
No, you
can buy
cannot.
people voluntarily. See, that's your assumption. Your assumption, Snake, and this is why you lost the debate, is that you're assuming that
I
people
actually
cannot
won
be bought and
from
sold
two non-atheists told me, and
to
one Bible
non-atheists.
believer and one
Oh my God,
Jew
Richard Madsen.
told you that you lost the debate. So
Yeah, Richard Madsen.
um
All right.
if you want to
So
bring that up.
this is where
So
okay,
if
this is where
you
I think you lost the debate. You were not able to show that the people who are coming from nations around are coming by force. You
I don't
assume
have
that.
to.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
know
have
you
to.
don't have to show that. That's why you lost the debate, because you don't
Right.
think you
Well,
have
thank
to
you
show
for
that.
agreeing.
I
I
think
don't
you
have
do
to
have
show
to
that.
show
All I
that.
have to show is that consent is not necessary. It never says you need their
That's an
consent.
assumption. That's an assumption. That's an omission.
Nope.
It's an argument from silence. You have to be able to demonstrate. The burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that these people are coming by force, that they're being rounded up and being slaughtered, or some of them being chained, maybe even, and forced to work against their will. All it
They are
says
not allowed to
is that,
go. They are made
where
slave
does
for
it
life.
say that? Where does
Right
it say they
here.
weren't allowed to
Leviticus
go?
25:46. They are made slave for life.
And someone can make me a slave for life and not be breaking any laws.
Not in
Snake, you
America.
haven't been. Yes, you can. If
No.
someone wants to make me a slave for life, and I agree to that, no laws have been broken. No one will
No.
come arrest me or him or
Yes,
my
they will.
master. No, they will not.
Yes, you can.
You
You
cannot
cannot
cite a law.
enforce slavery on
Now
any
you're
person
jumping. You're moving
or
the
for life.
goalposts.
That is, you're lying. This is
You're moving the
beautiful.
goalposts.
You are so
You're
deluded.
moving the goalpost again.
No,
I
I'm
didn't
not
say
moving the
anything about
goalpost.
enforcing. I didn't say anything about
Yes,
enforcing
you
work.
did. You said force.
Listen carefully.
How are you
Listen
going to?
carefully.
How are you going to
Listen care-
force someone to be a slave if you're not
Okay.
enforcing the
Listen.
slavery?
Listen carefully. You cannot demonstrate that me working or being the property of someone else, or being a slave for life, that in of itself is not enough to indict my master. You
You
need
can
to be
say
able
that
to
all you want, but
demonstrate.
it's false.
Hold on. You need to be able to demonstrate that the master forced me into that situation. That's what you cannot do. That's what Dr. Josh cannot do. That's when we ask him for these passages. He goes to Deuteronomy 20, which is again when you go to war. So he's forced to go to warfare where people are taken captive and say, aha, slavery. So you can't just assume that because you're seeing buying and purchasing in the Old Testament, um, Boaz acquired his wife. No one threw stones at him and said you're a slave. This is slave trafficking. So you can't take a word like purchase and try to force it into a 21st century or what we would understand purchasing to mean. It just simply means there was an acquisition, a transaction, a financial transaction.
And
That's
you
all.
can't take the word kidnap and force it into a 21st century understanding because you know that
I
that's
didn't.
false. But
I read
what?
the
Yes,
rest
you
of the
did.
text.
You absolutely did.
I did.
But
I read the rest
it's
of the
my turn.
text.
It is my turn to talk now. So, you said that I didn't demonstrate that I have to demonstrate that it was forced. No, I only have to demonstrate that force is allowed. And yes, force is allowed because you can make them quote
Where's the
from
force?
God, from your God, you can make them slaves for life.
Where's
That
the
is not
force?
up to them. And where's the force?
Yeah.
It says you can make them slaves for life,
And
you
someone
beat
can make
them.
me their slave for life.
So
It's still not forcing.
how is this supposed to come true unless I can enforce what God has told me that I
I
can do?
voluntarily allow you to make me your slave for life.
It doesn't
That's all.
say anything about that. It
Your
says I can make you a
your
slave for
male and
life.
female slaves
So
are two
whether you like it or not, it doesn't
You make
matter. It
my
just says I
slaves.
can make you a slave.
Yes, that's your prerogative. If you want to be made a slave for life, the Bible says you would
Stop
show
lying.
your dedication
It
by
doesn't say
piercing
that.
your ear. Yes, it does. It says you would
It says
would
that
pierce your
for
ear.
Israelites,
And no, it doesn't say
male
that for
Hebrew slaves.
Israelites. That's your
Yes, it
assumption.
does.
You haven't provided a drop of
Right here.
scholarship to
Right
support
here.
that.
When you buy a male Hebrew slave, so not even all
You
Hebrews,
haven't
only male
provided
Hebrew slaves, he will serve you for 6 years. There, his master will pierce his ear with a pointed tool, and he will serve as him as slave for life.
right. And
This is
those
only for
people,
male Hebrew slaves. I
those
never want to catch you with that lie again.
those people who are Hebrews would make their dedication to the Suzerain. The Suzerain would be God, of course, and they would become part of Israel. And then all of the benefits of Israel would apply to them. So when you come to America, America doesn't have slaves because America has different levels of citizenship. You have a green card. You have people who are here on a work visa. So when you come to America, if you want to be included in all of the benefits of America, you would denounce your country and you would then become an American citizen. That's not to
Which is
say that
why there's a
those who don't
difference
do
between
that,
foreign slaves and
let me
Hebrew
let me
slaves.
finish. That's not to say that those who don't make that decision are now slaves. You might be able to call them second class citizens, but they're not forced to be there. Either party is not forced to be there. So just pointing to differences in how rules or benefits that people get for joining Israel that people don't get is not proving that either party is being forced.
Thank you for admitting that there are differences, and the details of this absolutely prove that it's force. First of all, this is coercion because it's
Yeah, you haven't proven that.
family, because he's holding your family hostage. And
What? I've already explained that
and
passage.
I'm not going to repeat myself endlessly on this, but if you can make someone a slave for life, you can beat them.
Where does it
That
say
means
you can
that
beat
you can enforce them being a slave for life, which means you
Why
can
would
force them to be a
why
slave
was the
for
slave
life.
being beaten?
So, which
Why was the
I
slave
don't
being
know.
beaten? You don't know. See, you don't know these things. So why are
Yeah,
you
because
assuming?
this is just a
Why?
general
Oh, hold
rule.
on,
I
hold
don't
on.
know
No,
why
no,
a
no, 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 no,
specific
no,
person
no,
is
no.
beating their
Why are
slave.
you assuming then that they're being beaten for what reason? You don't even know.
I
So
don't.
what's
Yeah,
the point?
correct. I
So why
know
should we
that
trust what you're
they,
saying when you don't even know why the slave is being beaten? You're just
because
assuming
it
he's
doesn't
being beaten.
matter. You can beat
Exactly. It
them.
doesn't matter to those who aren't honest with the text. And
You,
that's
you
what you've
can beat
shown. You're
them.
not being honest with the text. You can just beat them just because they're slaves. That's your
Yeah.
proof. That's your
Yep.
argument. What's your
Yep.
proof of
That's
that?
what the text says.
The text doesn't say that.
Yes, it does.
That's your assumption. No text says that you can beat them just because they're slaves. There's
They are your
actually
property.
there's actually Bible for you to read that talks about when anyone could be beaten, and that's in Deuteronomy 25. The same book that you claim teaches slavery because slaves are being beat. Slaves would be beat for the same reasons that a non-slave would be beat for breaking the law. Deuteronomy 25
Yeah, for not
talks about
working.
flogging. No, if you break the Mosaic law, not because
You're
you didn't
telling
work,
me right now that if a slave refused to work, you could not beat that slave?
that wouldn't be just the reason to beat him according to Mosaic
So
law.
the slave can just sit around and say, I'm not working
Again,
with no
you're
consequences?
there weren't
Is
no
that
beta males back then.
is that what
They
you
would not
are?
that would not have been the attitude. The attitude would have been, this is my responsibility.
I don't care what the
I
attitude is. I
break.
care what the law
Okay, well
is.
then you don't care about what's
You're
going
just
on in the ancient
assuming
Near East. Then
you're just assuming this
you're
noble population of slaves who have work ethic. That's
yes,
bullshit, and you
yes,
know it.
and they would take an oath. It wasn't like these beta males today who can't
Clearly,
keep a
there are
job.
people breaking the laws. Clearly, there are people who
So
don't have honor. Clearly, there are people sinning. So,
of
what
course,
happens if a
right.
slave refuses to work?
Again, the slave
You're
master would
refusing to
only
answer. All
be.
right.
I,
So,
I just answered you. The slave master, according to the law, would only be allowed to enact justice. He would have to take him to court. He would have to take him to what they considered to be court back then, and he would have to be found guilty of breaking the law, and then he could be flogged. He could be um, beaten, basically. The judge shall make him lie down and have him flogged
no,
in the presence of the number of lashes his crime deserves. Deuteronomy
no. This
25.
is when people have a dispute. This is between disputes between free Israelite citizens,
Your
not between
assumption.
slave and master.
That's your assumption. It
No.
says when men have a
It
dispute.
says your
Doesn't say,
fellow Israelite.
no, it says when men have a dispute. Deuteronomy 25, verse 1. It says when
Right.
men
And then
have a
talking
dispute.
about the guilty party, it says your fellow Israelite.
It says when men have a dispute, they are to take it to court and judges will decide their case. So acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lie down and be flogged. Didn't say anything about Israelite versus non-Israelite. Again, the laws apply to everyone.
Okay.
You weren't able to get away with a crime because you were not an Israelite. So were
Even if we
non-Israelites
grant
allowed to rape?
even if we
Were
grant this
Israelites
lie,
allowed to rape?
even if we grant this lie, you still have a judge forcing the slave to work.
Were Israelites allowed to rape each other or rape other people or rape
They were allowed
foreigners?
to rape women captured in war. They were allowed to
You-
rape slaves.
So were our soldiers in World War II. I know. Yeah, we've already been through that one. That's going to be clipped. I'm just warning you.
Because
You're
you are now comparing.
That's going to be clipped. Not
Yeah,
by
you're
myself.
full of shit, dude.
Not by myself. I'm not going to clip it.
Go ahead
because
and clip it.
I'm
Go
gonna
ahead
I'm
and
gonna play the
compare.
whole.
Go ahead and compare World War II laws to biblical law. Okay.
Yeah, you
just
just said in front of all of these people that what that was rape.
No, I didn't. You're a liar.
You said that was rape. You said that when the
Nope.
soldier.
I said what's in the Bible is rape.
Okay, so when the soldier, after killing the entire village and wiping out, napalming the entire village, and
Why are
there's
you
the captive.
changing the subject?
I'm not changing the subject.
Yes, you are.
You're running
I'm
from
talking
this
about
because this is what.
Israelites.
Right, and I'm giving you a scenario in which someone will marry a captive. You're trying to look at
There
the
is no
Bible.
law you can
You're
point
trying
to
to
for
look at the
World War
Bible
II captives
and
that
say
say you can just force them to marry you. There
you're
is
trying
no
to,
law.
and you haven't demonstrated that. You're looking
There
at
is a law for Israelites for that, though.
You haven't demonstrated force. You
I
just
did. I
saw
quoted it
what
a
there were
million times.
people where
So
God says that you can marry them, and you say that that's force. So I'm asking you if a soldier, because this isn't against the law
I
in
don't care
America.
what the soldier does. I care
Well,
what the
then you're
law
not
says.
being honest. You're not being honest, or you're being two-sided. You're being double.
No.
You
Can you
have two
show? Can you show
standards.
a similar law?
You have two standards. You have
Show me
one
the
for
law.
America and
Show me
one
the law.
for moral standard for the Israelites. And
Show me
I'm
the same
wondering
law.
why that is. So in
So you
America,
can't show me the
our
law.
laws, there is no law for what you can do.
Yes, there are.
Laws are not designed in America to tell
No,
you what you can do.
that's bullshit.
That's okay. Show me a law that says what you can do. Go ahead.
When I went over the Kyle Rittenhouse case, it said you may own a firearm under these certain conditions.
You may own a
I
firearm
know.
under
I
these
know
circumstances.
that is
Okay.
part of it. That
Okay.
is a
So
law that I can cite.
okay. So the majority of laws are something you're saying what you can't do, right? And there
It
are laws
doesn't
that
matter.
says that what you
Show
can
me a
do.
law that
Okay.
says that
So
you can just that
so
the
we
woman
don't
is made
need.
a wife just because you want her to be.
Okay. So there are
You
laws
can't.
in our jurisprudence that say what you can do. So there are laws in our laws that say what you can't do. The same thing in Israel. In Israel, you can marry war captives, and God told them that what they can do. In our country, there's no explicit law saying you can do it, but there's no law against it. So if a soldier were to do that, he would not be up on war crimes. Why is that? Why isn't the soldier up on war criminal charges? Because there's no law
Because
saying
she
that he can't do that.
consented.
Who consented?
If she consents,
If she consents. So you
right.
do account for volition when it comes to the American soldier. Thank you. It's called special pleading, and that's why you lost it today.
Nope, because you cannot show a law that says that it doesn't matter what her consent is. If he wants her, he shall have her. But I can show that in the Bible.
Snake.
Whoops.
You just demonstrated your special plead for the American soldier who's doing exactly what the
No, I
Israelites doing.
don't. I guarantee you
And you
that there
say
were
if
tons of
she wanted
American
to do it.
soldiers who
So
raped and enslaved women
then
on their travels.
their punishment is death according to the Bible. According to you, he gets 10 years.
Good.
But
I don't care.
the idea is that these people are here voluntarily.
They're
You're
not. It
trying
doesn't
to
say that.
force them to be there against their will,
You made
but
that up.
you seem to have a hard time demonstrating that.
You made that up.
Can you demonstrate that the female in this case, now when it came to the American soldier, you gave the conditional phrase if. You said, well, if she wants to consent, why
If she
couldn't
has
you
the
do
right
that?
to consent.
Right. Why wouldn't you do that with the Israelite? Well, if
Because
she
she
wants to
doesn't have the right to consent.
you're assuming that.
No, because
You're
it only
assuming that
says
because the
that
text
the
says
man
what
needs
she
to
can
consent.
do. Anyway, so if she were
I
to
don't
give the
care. I'm
same,
not
if
saying
she
that
were
all
to
women
give,
are blameless because they're
okay,
women.
if she were, the text would apply to her as well. So
Yep.
just because it uses the word or the pronoun he, doesn't mean that the woman that this wouldn't apply to a woman as well. It applies to both men and women. No one was to treat anyone less than
No,
human.
it doesn't. She's not allowed to take a wife under biblical law, is she?
She's not allowed to take a wife?
Yeah.
What? Why would she want to do that?
Because that's what the law says. If
Why
you
would she want
desire
to do
to
that?
take a woman to be your wife, she shall be your wife. That's
Right.
all it says.
Right, and the same thing would apply to a female military leader.
No, because that is homosexuality, which is condemned in the Bible.
No, I didn't say it would be a man actually, but the same thing would apply to a female leader. If your soldiers want to marry, right? Of course, the soldiers would be men because men
Why
fight.
does the gender of the leader matter?
Men fight, therefore they don't have volition. That's your assumption you're forcing onto the text. It doesn't follow.
Nope, that was
Men are in charge,
assertion.
therefore women have no volition. That's your assumption.
Says she shall be your wife if you want to, therefore she has no volition.
Right. Yes, because it was the man, it was the suzerain who's making the decision to take on the vassal. So the suzerain was the one that's in charge.
Bullshit.
And therefore, he's making the decision. It's sort of like
a
if
treaty
you're a
between
man
two
dating,
nations,
you get to decide who your wife will be.